All right, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the work session of the Newcastle Town Board of Tuesday, January 24th, 2023. Can I please have a motion to open the work session?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, well, hello. We are happy today to welcome our illustrious state senator, Peter Harcum, is joining us via Zoom today. And we asked the senator to come today just to say hello, give us an update as to what he anticipates in the 2023 legislative session, and potentially to talk to us a little bit about the proposed 2024 budget and anything else that you want to bring up. So with that in mind, I'm going to say welcome and turn it over to you, Senator Harcum.
Well, Madam Supervisor, thank you so very much for the invitation, and honorable board members, Madam Clerk, Madam Administrator, so great to see everybody. Thanks for having us. With me is Victoria Duty, our District Director. She'll put her information in the chat. If you ever need anything, of course, please feel free to reach out. Maybe we'll start with the easier and work our way to the more challenging. So just one update. As you know, for 4 years I chaired the Committee on Alcoholism and Substance Abuse and the Task Force on Opioid Addiction Overdose Prevention. Starting this term, I'll be chairing the Committee on Environmental Conservation. So I'm really excited. As you know, back in my county ledge days, a lot of work in that wheelhouse. Obviously, we've got a lot on our plate. We've got the scoping plan of the CLCPA. We did a 10-hour hearing last Thursday on that. Water quality issues, especially for all of us in the east of Hudson watershed, always loom large. Pesticides, chemicals, waste reduction. We know that's an issue that impacts you at the local level. And so what is our waste policy moving forward? So we're going to have a full docket. We had our first committee meeting today. We've got a really talented group of senators, and it's going to be a nice committee assignment. So I'm excited about that. So we did get the state address and the book that we got. Obviously details are few and far between. We're waiting for the actual budget. The latest it can come is February 1st. So I would suspect, in the next 7-8 days we'll have the budget, and that's where the details are. Some good news there. The governor is keeping all of our commitment to get to 100% of fully funding foundation aid in this year's budget. That is a very positive first step. No new taxes is her commitment. We'll see what the legislature's view on that is, but we're in a tax-sensitive district. Westchester, with our property taxes and other taxes, are among the highest taxed in the nation. So fiscal responsibility is important. There are some housing issues in the state of the state, and again, it's hard to really fully evaluate until we see the Article 7 language. The governor is proposing a new housing compact. Some of it sounds like a repackaging of some things that have been done in past transit-oriented development. Has been in the budget ever since I've been in the Senate, so for the last 4 years. And for the last 4 years, it was defeated. I think primarily for a couple of reasons. One, that it primarily just impacts the lower Hudson Valley, Long Island. And two, it's just not practical in many of the communities and which we represent. Many of you know I'm more bullish than most on housing, but the plan has to work if we're going to implement it, and it certainly didn't work under the former governor. We'll see what the governor is talking about with transit-oriented development. Here's talking a lot more about incentives. Are those incentives just for the projects, or are those incentives for other infrastructure needs in a given community. That's an incentive. So, those are calculations that individual municipalities would need to make. We will, of course, be looking at the details of the Article 7 language within the next week when we get the full budget delivered to us. A lot of the other things they were talking about, incentives, technical assistance on multifamily zoning, all of us lived through that during the housing settlement, and most of our communities passed the model ordinance, working with the monitor and the county board, and we all remember the drama that went along with that. But many of our communities already have multifamily zoning in place. So when we first saw this proposal, I spoke to the governor's folks, and I told them that you get north of Mount Kisco, and many of our municipalities don't have infrastructure. You look at what was just done in Katona and Bedford Hills, but by agreement with DEP, that was just for the existing build out that was there. There was no new expansion or build out allowed. You get up into Golden's Bridge and Purdy's and Croton Falls. There is certainly no infrastructure. That's 100-year-old septic system. You get up into Brewster, they're looking to do their own transit-oriented development. You get up to Southeast, the train station is nothing but a train station. There's certainly no infrastructure up there. So, it's really challenging. And then are these going to be are people going to be able to access infrastructure in a meaningful way, or is it, you just have access to the same convoluted process that we've always had, that takes 7, 8, 9 years to get a grant for a particular water project or sewer project, and by that time the costs have gone up immeasurably. So there's a lot to unpack here. I wish we had more specifics that I could report to you. We will get the Article 7 language in the next week. She also mentions ADU. I'm not sure what she is talking about in her ADU. I will tell you that I am working with the Westchester County Municipal Officials Association. They now have an ADU committee. After the conversations that we've had last year, we're working very collaboratively. Harvey Epstein and I will be putting in a new bill this year, which will be completely based on incentives, completely voluntary. Things like extra points on a consolidated funding app, perhaps extra severe winter weather repaving money or CHIPS money. Those kinds of things. So, we'll see how our proposal differs from hers. One of the things that we also need to look at in her compact is she talks about, setting certain growth targets. Is she coupling these programs together, or are they separate? So, that's the other thing that we need to look at. But, if you're talking about growing your housing production, we do know that some of our communities do have available land, and some of our communities don't have available land. So again, we need to look at the specifics of what the governor is proposing in her plan. We know this has not been a popular proposal the last 4 years. It was proposed. And that's why it was defeated. So, we really need to see how enticing the enticements are, or is it more of the same that is kind of repackaged. So, that's kind of just a very, very brief overview of some of the things in the state of the state, and a couple of the things that I'm working on, and really happy to field questions from board members.
So I understand that the legislation hasn't come out yet, but also I would hope, given that you're now chair of the Environmental Conservation Committee, I would hope that you would also look at, even if there are lands available, like for instance, we have parkland. I would hate to have to give up parkland in order to increase our housing stock by 3%, because
Oh, yeah, and you know, that could never happen, because in order to do that, you'd have to alienate other lands, you'd have to come to the legislature for that. So I remember when the housing settlement first, was entered into, you know, some years ago, and the monitor was driving around with one of the supervisors, and he was saying, well, look at all this land, look at all that land. And they had to inform them that it was parkland. And so, you know, parkland could not be alienated for housing. So at least that's one protection we have.
I mean,
certainly the wetlands that we have is another.
Right. I mean, I guess she could legislate differently, but we'll have to see when it comes in. But certainly I wouldn't want to have to be cutting down significant amount of trees. I want to make sure that we are protecting our environment, as well as, you know, looking to increase housing stock. I think is laudable and something we want to do, but we really need to understand that. How does that need to be done? Do we get credit for anything? The 60 plus units that we've done of housing in the past couple of years, and additional housing, do our townhomes that are already approved, the 91 townhomes that we're looking to build at Chappaqua Crossing, do those factor into it, or are we including those in our baseline numbers? So
right, those are great questions, because you know, you have things in the pipeline, and that's exactly what she's trying to get at. So if you have things in the pipeline, you should get credit for those.
Right, so I guess we need to understand all of that. And so where are you going to just reserve judgment? Where are you? What are your thoughts in regard to the TOD legislation? And I would hope that you would advocate. I would much rather see, you know, your ADU bill and see what that has to say, because I know you've been working with WMOA, and I know you've been diligently listening to municipalities and really starting from the bottom up, which I think is the way this legislation should happen, instead of kind of a top-down mandate. So I really appreciate everything you've done, and I would hope you would advocate that she should take her ADU legislation, whatever that may be, out, and give yours the opportunity to pass through legislative channels.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, we'll see what she does. You know, there's obviously a give and take in the budget, and we could negotiate taking hers out, putting ours in. You know, again, I'm not in past years I've not been supportive of TOD, just because it simply hasn't been actionable or practical. And you know, a lot of the conditions that we have that make it challenging through mandate, you know, you can't mandate something be built when DEP has put severe restrictions on the amount of wastewater treatment plants in the watershed. You know, that's just a fact of the watershed agreement that was signed, you know, what was it, 25 years ago, that there'd be no new wastewater treatment plants in the watershed. So, you know, it makes it that much more challenging, if not impossible, to create large-scale housing if we can't create more wastewater treatment. So there are a lot of systemic obstacles. You know, I like the idea of incentives. I like the idea of goals as opposed to mandates. You know, those of you who are old enough to remember back to Andy Spano's Housing Opportunities Commission put out a housing opportunities report that just had regional goals by municipality. They were just goals. There were no mandates, and you know, there was a lot of blowback to that. So, you know, I think we really need to work collaboratively with our municipalities. I just don't know if they're aware of some of the challenges that we face, particularly here in the watershed. And so, you know, that's my job, is to educate them on that stuff. I've already had conversations with them on some of the watershed issues. And you know, if we need to push, we push. And if we need to educate, we educate.
Right. And I would just say, you know, I know you mentioned like areas north of Mount Kisco have infrastructure issues. We're south of Mount Kisco, and I would argue that we have significant infrastructure issues as well in terms of significant wetlands. We had failing septic systems in many areas of our municipality. We're predominantly a septic system municipality as well. So I would argue that we have those issues, even though we are not north of Mount Kisco. We are directly south.
Yeah, got it.
Any other questions on this issue? Then I do have one other. Anything else?
Yeah, I just want to mention, well, first of all, thank you, Senator Harcum, for taking the time to be here during your busy
My pleasure. Thank
busy
you.
budget season. I just wanted to say that I do think that the governor's housing compact raises a lot of serious issues. And I think that you hit it right on the nail when you said it has to be workable. And our communities, as you know, are very unique. And I think that the incentives are useful only if there are no structural issues that are getting in the way, such as our infrastructure issues, which Lisa just described regarding our septic systems with capacity issues, our lack of sewers, and the fact that we do have a lot of wetlands. And we also have a water treatment plant that has capacity issues. I know that in the summer, it reaches its limits, and we have, as you know our town, we have very narrow streets. So every community is unique, and I think that the goals are understandable, but the workability and what every community can accomplish would be something very important for the governor to understand. And I'm not so sure that the budget process gives anyone the time to go over what each community can really do. So I just wonder if there's an opportunity at this point to put it back into the legislative process. It may already be too late for that, but it's it would be
the thing is,
very
you raise
helpful.
an interesting point. When there are fiscal implications, and she's talking about money as an incentive, then it has to be done in the budget. If it's strictly policy, so people were wondering last time why ADU was in the budget is because at the time she was tying it to $85 million in the budget for to assist people to convert illegal to legal and make them safe. So there was a budgetary component. If we're just talking about pure ADU without a fiscal implication, we can easily do that out of the budget. I think what her housing compact is talking about is having a fiscal incentive, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's repaving money, whatever it is that she will announce are the incentives. Therefore, it would need to be done in the context of the budget. But you're right. Governors have historically tried to cram the budget full of their prerogatives, and it leaves a very short amount of time for analysis. And that's why certain items are pulled out and done legislatively later in the session.
To Vicky's point, I would say that the $250 million that's proposed as incentives for and money for infrastructure to allow municipalities to upgrade infrastructure for TOD is not even remotely sufficient to warrant it being in the budget. It should be taken out. I mean, $250 million over all these municipalities to deal with infrastructure issues that would result from this is a very small amount of money. So I would argue that that is not enough to be included in the budget, so it should be taken out and go through the regular legislative process.
Yeah, it could, and those would be the discussions that we have, and that's why I raised the question early on. Is the inducement just to give a municipality a couple $1 million to do that particular project, build a small package plan? Or is the inducement, hey, I know you've got an old water treatment plant on the other side of town, and you really like to sewer the other side of town, we'll give you the money to do those projects if you agree to do something on the other side of town. That to me is much more of an inducement. than just saying, we'll give you the infrastructure money to do something that you may not want to do. That's not an inducement.
Mm-hmm. Right, and for instance, to get sewers in Millwood, right, it's gonna be $60 million, I think. So
Right,
coming
right,
out of that
yeah.
250, and we're just one small municipality.
Right. So, you know, and then that's an internal calculation that, you know, if someone wants to cut you a check for $50 million to put sewers on that side of town, you know, then it's your internal calculation with your planning department. All right, well, can we, you know, is it worth it for us to push 3% of development to get that inducement? $50 million is a pretty big inducement. You know, it's $1.2 million for a package plan, an inducement, you know, maybe not.
Right. So, okay, so changing just topics for a second. When do you think we will have more clarity around what types of grants we can apply for under the Environmental Bond Act?
You know, I spoke to the commissioner today. They are working on getting draft rules together that would need to go out for public comment. So they're not there yet, but they will have something out for public comment soon. We know what the buckets are going to be, but as far as what it is that folks can apply for, we're not quite there yet. But I will, as soon as I hear something, I'll let you know.
Perfect. All right.
I do want to add something though, going back to the housing compact and transit-oriented development. And you mentioned Brewster, and I know that they're making a big effort there to have TOD developments. And I do know that there are communities, or at least a community there, that's being displaced. So I know that there are going to be unintended consequences that are quite negative, which these legislative efforts try to improve upon. So it's a bit of an irony, and I just wonder if there's any thought given to these kinds of consequences.
Oh, absolutely. You know, that's a local project. That's not being driven either by the governor or by the state legislature. You know, and that's one of the reasons why DEC, in their new approval process for certain permits, looks at cumulative impacts. You know, is a community, an environmental justice community, for instance, being overburdened with additional burdens. In this case, you're right. You know, displacing a vibrant immigrant community, and those are all the kind of things that we need to look at holistically when making these decisions.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, so I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with you once the legislation comes out and we all have a chance to quickly digest it.
Yeah, I mean, put your coffee pot on. We're not gonna have a lot of time because this budget is coming a couple weeks later than is normal. There's a custom that when a governor wins their first election, they're allowed to submit the budget 2 weeks later. So, seeing, you know, she stepped into office, but this was her first, you know, natural election. So she's entitled to that 2-week grace period. So normally we get it around mid-month, and now we're getting it at the end of the month, no later than February 1st. So it's no doubt going to be a truncated budget process, and you know, we'll dive in and we'll stay in close contact.
All right. Thank you. And you know, to the extent you hear of other grant monies that are available to us, we'd love to be informed because we've got plenty of things to spend money on.
All right, you know what we can do? We can arrange a Zoom offline. We'll get your list of priorities, and then, you know, sometimes it's easier for us to like hear your priorities and then for us to go look for the money, as opposed to, you know, us just sending you kind of red herrings that may or may not be helpful.
Perfect. I'll make sure we schedule that.
All right, terrific.
All right.
Terrific.
Well, thank you,
All right,
Senator.
thank you, everybody. Terrific to see everyone.
You too. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
you coming.
Thank you, Senator.
All right, thanks so much.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. All right. Well, that was great. I'm looking forward to hearing more from him as we get that information. Ed, well, can we hold off on these administrative items, just given,
Yeah, I thought that was
Is
the
everyone
plan.
here?
We could just go right
I only see one member of the planning board though so far.
the Lone Ranger so far.
Tom Carl.
Although I think Tom might have been here, yeah.
Somebody else, Mayor Carter.
All right, well, why don't we go through them quickly?
It's only if you guys have any questions,
Any questions, anyone?
we've got a payment of claims, authorization to approve partners in safety agreement, that's our, pre-employment physicals, our, drug and alcohol testing, in case of accidents or randomly. Next is, our CSEA employee benefit agreement. The town pays for vision and dental for CSEA members and management as well. The police are looking to approve their annual installment contract for the voice recording system. It's just shy of $10,000, so although it's completely in the budget and it's a long-standing contract, we just bring it to your attention because it is one of the larger expenditures and I want the board to be aware of it. Next is the return of a street opening permanent bond where work has been satisfactorily completed. And that's all we've got for our admin items.
All right, any questions?
No.
Okay, thank you, Jill. So Ed, just a point of order, do we need to close the work session and open the joint meeting, or it's part of our work session?
It's really part of the work session, but
Okay.
you may wanna open the joint work session by motion.
All right, so can we close the solo work session? Can I have a motion to do that?
Motion to close the work session. And second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, so we're gonna take a short break while we move over to the table here and convene with our planning board members, and we will be back to everyone shortly.
Sure you're ready.
Okay, you're live.
All right.
Wait, I'm not
Good evening, everyone.
I'm ready.
Ready or not,
We're
we're
ready.
starting.
Go.
Can I please have a motion to open the joint work session with the town board and the planning board?
I move to open the joint work session with the planning board and town board.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, is there a motion to open our meeting here, the three of us?
So moved.
So moved. Second.
Second.
Dick Brownell is going to be appearing, I believe, remotely. He's not quite there yet. Sometimes we have some issues. And then Eldad will be here in a few moments, and I think Sabrina will be joining us around 7:15, she said.
Okay, perfect. So welcome everyone who's watching, and welcome to the planning board again. I want to thank you guys. We're seeing an awful lot of you, and we love it. Because I think this is a great way to work together. I really do.
I like the first part. I wonder about whether you really love it.
I
but-
do. So before we got started, I wanted to just give a few words to anybody who's watching and kind of to frame it. So we are here again tonight to continue our joint work on the proposed zoning legislation that would facilitate what I think we all believe is an exciting proposal for development of the vacant Rite Aid property. The project would replace the beautiful empty and dilapidated building that's there now with 45 residential apartments and a diner on the ground floor. I want to thank all of you on the town board and the planning board for all the work that you've put in and I know will continue to put in on this legislation. For those of you watching, we held a joint work session on January 10th and we're having another one tonight. We may also have another one in the future, but we appreciate all of your efforts. So before we begin, I wanted to just set the stage with a few thoughts. I think this is important work, and we just had Senator Harcum come talk to us about the proposed 2024 budget. You know, we have a housing shortage in Westchester and throughout New York State. Here in Newcastle, our comprehensive plan, which we updated in 2017, did recognize the need to create more housing opportunities for empty nesters, seniors, young professionals, and low to middle income households centered around our hamlet. So how do we do this? So the town was against establishing a form-based code for the Chappaqua Hamlet. We heard that from voters, we heard that from many residents, and I personally have no desire to resurrect that. But rather, I think we need to look at what makes sense for individual parcels while keeping the needs and wants of our community in mind. Again, we also need to keep this proposed 2024 state budget in mind. It includes what's called the New York Housing Compact. If enacted, it would redesign the land use approval process in New York, which would allow the state in certain circumstances to actually override local zoning laws. It would have far-reaching impacts on every city and village in New York State. As currently proposed, it would require Newcastle to increase our housing stock by 3% every 3 years. And it also incorporates transit-oriented development, which would require that we undertake a local rezoning of higher density multifamily units within a half-mile radius of the train station here. And if we don't do this, again, the state will be able to come in and override our zoning while granting specific relief from environmental review. For various reasons, most municipalities, I believe, are fighting this proposed legislation. But I also think it's incumbent upon us to think toward the future because increasing housing is obviously a laudable goal. But if I had my druthers, I want to do it the way that makes sense for our community instead of being told later on how we need to do that. I think we also need to look toward the future on environmental front. We should be proud of what we do here in Newcastle. We were the very first municipality in New York State to become an environmental conservation climate smart community, and we have the highest designation there. And we recently adopted the New York State Stretch Code, so we certainly, have the goal of sustainability and the environment in mind. Also, the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act requires by 2030, 70% of the statewide electric generation be generated by renewable energy systems, and by 2040, that number is 100%. So the fact that we could potentially have a net zero building, I think is exciting and would really put us on the map in Westchester, certainly. So tonight, we're gonna be talking about your preliminary draft referral memorandum on the proposed zoning legislation. So your memo is, the draft memo is great, and it provides input on kind of granular level and then also big picture policy level. So I'm sort of suggesting that we start on that big picture level, and then work our way to granular.
Makes sense.
So in my view, I think there are basically three things we should focus on tonight. The first being the special permit. And should that be, can we keep it as a special permit as proposed? Do you wanna use an overlay zone or some other form? And are we gonna broaden the scope of that at all? The second being talking about parking. Our parking standards, as you well know, date back to the 1970s. Preliminary calculations are suggesting that as few as 5 off-site spots might be needed. Now, again, we need to look at this, but our train station alone could yield 25 to 100 additional spots with some relatively simple changes. So I want to talk about that. And then, obviously, if and when we adopt the legislation, the applicant will still need to satisfy whatever parking standards we put in there in order to obtain approval for the project. And then third, just talking about changing the application procedure and having joint public hearings with the planning board. As you probably all know, we have 18 other special use permits currently in our Newcastle Town Code. It's not unusual, some are even for single properties. Here, the planning board would actually have a greater role in site plan approval than is typical for a special permit. And like the PDCP process, we've never done that, I believe, for any other project other than Chappaqua Crossing, which obviously is on a much greater scale and incorporates many more different intricacies. So with that in mind, I think, why don't we start talking about those big picture items, and maybe the best place, unless you think, Bob, that there's another place you wanna start, I would propose just starting with one and talking about
Sure.
the use of the special permit and your thoughts on that.
Sure. And again, this is it's a draft memo, so it's still subject, we're gonna be talking about this again, I think, next week at our meeting. So it's still subject to negotiation, discussion, education, frankly, feedback, persuasion, whatever you wanna call it. So it is just a draft. We've worked on it, fairly carefully. So, but these were the major concerns, and of course, as Lisa mentioned, there are a number of smaller concerns, site issues that are, the lower things, the drilling down. So the issue in terms of it's I think actually 1 and 2 are sort of related because I think they flow together, and I think the issue in terms of the mechanism is again dealing with I guess the planning in terms of what happens in this area. And I think our concern really I don't know if you can really separate the two. The issue is I think one of really equity in terms of what happens. Is there the possibility of overstretching the capacity of other property owners? And if that is a concern and a valid concern, then it seems to me that, and just me at this point, that one of two things would happen: either the scale of the project gets scaled back, or we really, look at this and understand very carefully, what the impacts might be. So I think, again, we're proposing that if off-site parking is necessary, in order to look at off-site parking, we really need to have a good understanding of what the parking capacity is, future as well as present. If that's not involved, I don't think there's much need for that at all. So the issue to me, it seems, is the mechanism is okay as long as we have understanding that the impact is not one where it's going to disturb the property rights of others in the future. So I don't know really how you really break those apart, because I think 1 and 2 are really important and are interwoven. So those are my thoughts on it. My sense is that with understanding, we'll know better whether or not this is, and we see this frequently. I think we see this nationwide, locally as well. That an applicant is looking to stretch things and get, maximize the use of the parcel. And the issue for us, I think, is to make certain that this is not an overstretch, where the capacity is being stretched to the point where it's exceeding the, shall we say, the development capacity and the zoning capacity of this particular parcel in the context of where it's located. And so that, very often we see that. I mean, that's what a developer should do. They want to maximize and see what they can get. Clearly, just from the get-go, it's a request for, more than the two-story current zoning and whatever the current parking is. So we know that it's a stretch over what we normally look at. So it's just how much of a stretch and what are those impacts? So I think, if you're going to have an issue with off-site parking, and the study says we need to figure out different things and different approaches and different strategies. We talked about last time freeing up some parking behind, off by the station, which I thought was a terrific idea. And how that all works, I think that's. I think there's opportunity to make this work and to see how it works, but I think we need that information.
Can I ask a question in terms of the mechanism?
Mhm.
Would the mechanism, does that mean an overlay zone versus a special permit, and how differentiating between those two things would affect your concern, which is parking?
An overlay obviously is the problem with the overlay at this point is I think it becomes more of a burden on the applicant because it slows things down. We have to look at a much broader area. And we're cognizant of that. And, this is a site, I think it's exciting to think of this site as being developed because what it is now is very unexciting. So that's important. But I think, I don't think the mechanism, if we anticipate, let's put it this way. If we go with the current proposal, the legal question I have for Ed, and I've had this for Jennifer, is what would stop another applicant in anywhere in this district from coming forward with the same sort of application for the same ask? And where will the town's position be at that point in terms of answering that request? If in fact the off-site parking has been exhausted or really compromised, what do we say to that other applicant? And I think that is a basic fairness issue, basic equities issue. And I don't know what that mechanism would be where we would have the legal right to say, you know what, you have to stay to your two-story current BP or BR zoning, and we're not going to give you relief. We can't. If we give you relief, we're really going to have a problem. We've overextended ourselves. So I don't know if necessarily the mechanism or the way we go about it in terms of device matters that much. I mean, the downside for the overlay is the delay, but in either event, the key is getting the information so that we understand what we're doing. And we talked about the parking study. We really didn't get into it in great detail with the last round with the form-based code. But I tell you, there's suppositions that were presented about parking that, many of us thought were very suspect. So using the model of Bronxville, Pelham, Portchester, and imposing that on Newcastle, on Chappaqua, did not seem to make a whole lot of sense to a lot of us. We have a particular way that we live up here. We're further apart. Our public transportation system is nowhere near as robust as down county in terms of buses and trains and the frequency. So it's important to have a study or information that's based on real life suppositions that we have here in Chappaqua. So what do I mean by that? I mean that we really should recognize the way people live here. If you're in Pelham, if you're in Bronxville, and you need to go to the grocery store, you could walk. You can't do that here. it just doesn't work. We have a town which has got a topographical constraint. You know, we have a very steep hill, so it really constrains people's walking up the hill. We have a nice downtown, we have a nice area downtown, but a lot of that frankly has been taken up by, municipal activity and municipal buildings. So I think any parking study should be one that is not something that's imposed or modeled from somewhere else where the lifestyle and the uses are different from what we know are our experiences here. So I held it.
So sorry.
So anyway,
So,
does that help? Maybe not.
We moved into parking pretty quickly, didn't we?
so
I think it's interwoven. I really do.
to
Well,
me,
I-
just to answer your question really quick on the, what would prevent anyone else from coming. To me, this parcel and the one immediately north of it are different from any other parcel in the downtown. Because, in the Chappaqua Hamlet, because they are directly border a train track. They're very long and narrow. Every other parcel that I've at least looked at has a decent depth to it. To me, these parcels are very thin and long, and they really have issues in terms of development that I don't believe any of the other parcels have, and that to me is what differentiates them and why there are intricacies to developing there, such as, you put an apartment, you don't wanna have windows that can't open because they're directly over a train track, and if there's an issue, a derailment, something, you can't have windows that open. Whereas anywhere across the street or even closer toward the center of town don't necessarily have those issues because they're further setbacks from the train track. So to me, that's what differentiates these parcels from any other.
I
And why I
agree.
would argue the special permit makes sense there as opposed to anywhere else.
Well, I agree, but the legislation as proposed really doesn't make that argument. It makes the argument based on environmental issues and sustainable issues. And I would argue that could be presented from any property owner in the district to
Well, I
say that.
agree, I think it needs to be changed.
So, and also even the geographic, I agree with you. I mean, I recognize that, and I think that's an issue, but each parcel's got its challenges. The issue that I think is fairly realistic, especially once the hamlet gets going, is that you really could see the amalgamation of lots with a developer coming in saying, I can get together with these 4 different owners. We all know that they're individual small property owners at this point, and very unlikely that you see any sort of substantial application at this point. But that was one of the things that we pointed out in here that we really thought was inappropriate, that you would limit property owners to just whatever is the current property owner. And an applicant could only come from a property owner, which we think is frankly not what we see an awful lot even with our applications now. Very often you'll see a contract vendee coming in and making an application. So it could be 3 or 4 of these coming in with a concept. So I agree with you. There are definitely constraints for this, but I think the constraints actually make it more difficult for the applicant to expand beyond it. I'm not saying it's impossible. I think we need to be creative to do that.
Bob, I have to interrupt this narrative because,
He's had it with me.
not yet.
Not yet. It's much longer than usual.
This is not a difficult site. I'm sorry, it's not. It's the deepest site that we have downtown. It's the biggest site that we have in the hamlet. And if it's so difficult, why is the applicant able to get the equivalent density of 50, I haven't done the math, but others have. I'm gonna trust them for that. 56 units per acre. That's not a town density, that's an urban density. So it's actually the easiest site to develop here. So this narrative that there is some sort of a hardship is just not warranted. I'm sorry, it's just not. I mean, I'm an architect, I know how to do these things, it's not warranted.
Sorry, 1 second. We need to open that door for open meeting purposes. It can't stay closed.
How about that door?
I think they both have to be open. Thanks.
So is, what, you're pointing that out to say that you don't think there's a need for a special permit because it's
No,
not such a
I'm not saying that.
Oh, okay.
I just wanna dispel with that narrative
Okay.
because it keeps popping up and it's just not true.
Okay,
It's just mathematically, it's not true.
okay.
The other thing that I'd like to sort of, I know it's maybe nuanced, but I think it's important because we talked about equity for the other property owners, and I kind of think equity sounds like a social obligation, and that's up to you guys to figure out. I think it really, for what we worry about, it pertains more to the ability for everybody to actually develop their property. It's a planning problem, not a social equity problem. It's a not planning problem, planning challenge, a planning issue, not a social equity one. So I'd like to be careful about how we use those words here.
Appreciate that
Agreed.
clarification.
And it appears to me that it's possible that it may be true that the exclusive attention being given to this particular site by, I guess, this special permit process, I don't know, might inhibit or make it more difficult for the other properties to be developed. I can't certify that. I mean, that's such a big unknown, it's impossible to tell, I think. But what is maybe the echo of what's happening here is maybe that not sufficient attention is being paid from a planning perspective to the other side of the street, which means the whole of the street. And if the ultimate objective is, I think, the improvement of all of North Greeley, because it's not just one side of the street, right? If it's a two-sided street, there are property owners on both sides, and there's an opportunity somehow to facilitate, somewhere, somehow, there are opportunities to facilitate both sides. If this piece of property is first up, great, that's terrific. I think it's a terrific thing. I mean, don't get me wrong on that. So I think that it's more a question for you guys to resolve. Once we say, I think we say, this is really a planning issue for you guys to address or not address. You address it today or address it 2 years from now. I think we just put it on the table and say that's what we think you guys ought to be paying attention to in addition to this particular piece of property. And if it's a special permit that gets it done, I mean, I think that's fine, but I think we need to look at the text of the special permit because I gotta tell you, I mean, it may be evident from our memo, we think there are serious problems in here that need to be addressed.
Okay, good, that's why we're here.
Thank you.
So I'd like to share some thoughts at this point. Piggybacking a little bit on what Tom has said. So we referred a little bit here and there to the form-based code and knowing that that's what a lot of people in the community did not want. So that was pretty clear, but what's less clear is what people do want. And I'm sure you'd find a variety of opinions there. And I'm just beginning to think that if you compare this to the form-based code, we're going kind of from one extreme to the other. The form-based code was a one-size-fits-all for the entire hamlet. And now we've gone to looking at zoning for one parcel or two. And I just feel that we need a little bit more balance between the two. And as we talk about what is the difference between special permit, overlay zone, or floating zone, I think to what I said before, I prefer a more holistic view to planning rather than piecemeal, and I'm beginning to feel that this is more of a piecemeal process that we're engaging in with this one special permit. And we'll be using our town resources to do parking studies, traffic studies, stormwater, sewage capacity studies, etc. So in thinking about all of these zoning options, and this is still new to me, so you could correct me if I'm missing something, without wanting to slow down this application, would it make sense to look at a zoning vehicle, whether it's an overlay zone or a rezoning for North Greeley, and having this parcel be an overlay zone? I know that North Greeley is zoned for 2 stories, let's say. So just as an example, and I'm not saying this is what we would do, but just as an example, if we would rezone North Greeley for 3 stories, depending on where the parcels are situated. But this particular one could be 4 stories. would that work with just amending zoning legislation and then having an overlay zone for 50 North Greeley?
You
Is
still
that
have to
something,
vote
is
on
that
it.
something that could work?
You still have to go through the process. It might
There, yeah,
work
there's going to
technically,
be a process. I'm just trying to see what makes sense in terms of special permits or overlay zones or floating zones, and what makes sense in terms of planning itself, and trying to meld the two together to do something that makes sense for now.
So I think that Sabrina and Jennifer are gonna be able to give a much better answer to this than I can. But my intuition is that if you are going to create essentially a district which has a new zone, it may require further studies that you haven't done yet, that you don't have in hand. I mean, I don't think you could just, I'm not sure you could just wave a wand and say, okay, this is what we're gonna do. I think that there are broader studies that need to be done. It may take more time. You're gonna end up, I think, in a public review process that's going to have more people involved in helping you make that decision. And this particular initiative that's in front of you right now is gonna get sort of bound up in that process. I'm not sure that it's necessarily, the end result will necessarily be better or worse, depending on the end result, whether you go one way or the other. I think that as long as you put protections on what you do now, not to restrict what you may want to do in the future, I think you probably are safe moving ahead with the notion that you're gonna then address the other side of the street as a catch-up. Now, Sabrina and Jennifer maybe have some more technical and better ideas about that, but my guess is you could probably do it as long as you make sure you don't make it more difficult to do it downstream.
Yeah, so I think this is Jennifer. Hi, everyone. I agree with what Tom said. I think that if you were to rezone North Greeley as a whole for 3 stories, allow this parcel and perhaps the one to the north as overlay, what's gonna happen from a seeker perspective is the scope of your seeker review is gonna become much larger, because you're gonna have to study on a conceptual level what that means if all of North Greeley were to utilize the 3 stories. So it's gonna be a little bit more of an expanded seeker study. Parking would still be something that would need to be addressed. Obviously, that's a hurdle for the current petitioner for the proposed local law. But in concept, yes, I mean, that is a zoning mechanism that is an available concept. It would have some consequences with it, though, as we just discussed.
So, and I apologize for being late. It was very hard to get out of the office today. So I'm sorry for what I may have missed, but I'm very happy to be here. To have
Just
these-
missed my very long introduction.
I'll watch it on YouTube.
I'm sure you will.
I'm happy we're having these discussions. I think it's really important for our town, and I appreciate the opportunity to have these discussions with you all. You know, I always enjoy when we have our joint meetings. So I think that the idea of asking larger questions beyond 50 North Greeley is an important one. However, as we heard and as we assumed, it's a larger question that will take time and one that needs to be considered, certainly in light of what happened in this town over the last 2 years and how we want things to go forward over the coming several years. I don't think that, from my perspective, it needs to get in the way of decisions on 50 North Greeley. And as you've all seen from our memo, and we've had conversations about this a little bit, that there are 2 questions here. One is what's being proposed at North Greeley, is that appropriate or not, and what are the asks, and how should we address those? And 2, what is the mechanism to get that project approved or considered at least? I think uniformly on the planning board, and we don't have Dick here, but I think he would agree, what's being proposed we don't love. The language as written today, the special permit approach and the specifics in it, and we're happy to talk about that. But I wanna separate that from the discussions on the 2 major asks for 50 North Greeley, which are height and parking, which are very important topics, and we should kind of have those conversations also. Obviously, they are interlinked, but and there's process, right, which is a big one also, that we all care about, but I know Tom cares about very much so. Is that the proposal here sort of takes some authority away from the planning board, which is a decision, right? We need to make. So we should think about those two, I think, somewhat separately, right? The proposal as it stands and the process by which to address the proposal. When it comes to the process, it's not, it sounds like I missed some of it, but the way this is written, it's really muddy and it isn't perfectly zoning focused. And the question that has come up a bunch is that it talks a lot about the sustainability measures, and I love the sustainability measures, and I wanna make sure that they exist here. I just don't know that they belong in this
At your leisure.
all right. I just don't know that they belong in this zoning text.
Subpoena.
As
Being late.
yeah, as proposed. That just feels like it needs to be reworked to an extent. And the other piece that we discussed last Tuesday was, and I don't know if we have gotten answers yet on the question of the zoning district that this sits in is in the parking district. And if there's a way to either in an as of right way or an as close to as of right as possible, make it so that the parking issue is either eliminated or reduced because it's in the parking district. The parking district assumes that there are solutions to parking that are off-site. That's the purpose of the parking district. If there are ways to use that to our benefit here, to sort of take one of the issues off the table, we should consider that. That would be beneficial to sort of the complexity, to easing some of the complexity of this and addressing some of the process questions as well.
I think that personally, I'm just exhausted talking about parking. But that doesn't mean that it's not important.
Exhausted, I get it.
It's my wingman over here. But obviously it's critical to the ultimate developability of the entire corridor, right, everybody there. And it might be more important to people on one side of the street as opposed to people on the other side of the street because of the nature of those parcels are actually much more difficult to develop than the subject parcel we're talking about. I would like to suggest that we've talked enough about it that we sort of know what the issues are and we ought to wait for some facts, some information from, the traffic consultant, the parking consultant, to get those things in. I think there's some information that we could probably get right away in-house. I know that there's information that I picked off online from documents that we have as to how many parking spaces are now available, at least midday during the week and in the evenings during the week.
We definitely have that information.
We have that
I think it's
information.
part of the
It is.
parking study that they did.
It is. We also know generally how much retail development there is right now in the hamlet. I mean, if we don't know, we can go right over talk to Josh and get a tax rolls and find out just like that. Simple math, it seems to me, is so what's our effective parking ratio? How many parking spaces are being used for how much retail? I mean, that's like simple division, and that, by my calculation, it's somewhere between 2 and 3 per thousand, which is great news, right? A shopping center is typically 6 per thousand, but we have special circumstances here. I think that's great news. I just think we need to get into that before we get into, okay, now what do we do about it, because we don't know what it is yet. So I guess I'm suggesting that there's time better spent talking about things that maybe, we need to decide on, or you guys need to decide on. Things that have to do with policy, things that have to do with process and procedure, until we get the facts on factual things.
Sounds good to me.
Yes,
There-
it does.
There's one thing I'd like to add to this is, current, the one thing we should be aware of is if, right now we're saying either we're looking at one parcel or we looked at the whole hamlet, and now let's talk about a certain north corridor, right? I feel like when we go down that path, if there is an overflow or an implication on a slightly wider district than that, then it just seems to me that we will never have a perfect answer. So to me, it's important for us to say, if it was a site, this was the implication, if it was North Greeley, this is the implication. And then maybe there are special breaks you put in to say, well, there is going to be X overflow in terms of parking, and maybe there's an adjustment of, this is the 1980s parking laws and it's changed because of whatever, so there's a correction there, and so we've accounted for that. But to me, making the perfect sort of the detriment to starting a process seems like not the best avenue from my perspective. I totally agree, we need to understand if the entire hamlet was built out at the scope it was built out with, like, I don't know, 4 stories and had all this parking, where's all this parking gonna flow? Is it, and that's a good question to have. It's just, from what I understand, you're saying there's a site that doesn't make sense. We really need to make some amends there, start somewhere. And so the question is, you are going to have to make some assumptions for North Greeley, and then or even smaller or a little bit, so that's what I'm afraid of, that once we start looking at it, it just becomes bigger, and then the total was not fine too. So, we just need to account for that. And my second question was on special permits before. You said there were a bunch of them done before, and so it's interesting to understand what was the implication if a special permit similar to this was granted, whether going forward it had implications on what you had to build. And we were stuck in a situation where we were like, they got a special permit, so what about us, So is there precedent there that we can look to? That's the other question I can think of.
I don't think there was ever a situation where they said they got one, what about us?
Mhm.
I think, special permits are put there for a specific reason, and I don't recall that ever happening. And certainly the town board has a lot of leeway in terms of zoning, and we can or cannot grant it to anyone, basically, if we're changing it. So there could be circumstances here, for instance, that, because it's bordering the train tracks and it's gonna be a net zero building and certain things that we're allowing a special permit, but you just wanna put up a regular building, that may not be what we're striving to see. So I don't recall ever having an issue where they've said, oh, you did it over there, we wanna do it now here too. I know there was one, the Conifer building is a special permit, obviously. Is Chapel Crossing a special permit? No, that's a big overlay zone. I forget which other ones, but there's a whole list of them in the town code.
So am I hearing correctly that when I read your memo, I had a lot of questions because this isn't my field of expertise, and these are terms and words I didn't know, and it seemed to me like we were really gonna get stuck on a special permit versus an overlay zone. But now that we're sitting here, actually, that's not what I'm picking up from you guys, that actually there's some room there on your end to consider one versus the other, but that you're more concerned with some of the other language that's in the legislation, and that's more important. Am I summarizing that correctly? Am I getting that right from everybody?
I don't know if it's more or less, but certainly it's, we have those concerns. But I think Tom's right. There is certain, and I think Eldad's talked about this also. There are certain threshold issues that really are the town board's decision. And really, to a certain extent, bless you, you guys really have to sort of give some sort of direction on that, so it really helps us. So for example, the bottom line is, for example, is 60 feet appropriate for height? I mean, that's, at some point, we're not gonna make that decision, the town board has to make that decision. Is 56 per acre the appropriate density for this area of the town? You know, you guys are gonna have to make that policy decision. Is it absolutely necessary that you have to have retail in this location or not? We know that the elimination of retail, diner, whatever it might be, gives us a different solution, and probably a much easier solution than what we have right now. So is that something that the town board has to see, wants to see in this zone, this area? So we can't make that decision. Ultimately, we're throwing out, you know, it sounds like we're throwing out obstacles all the time. We're not. We're just throwing out issues to say, look, because of this, you have a different threshold now for parking. You have a different threshold for other kinds of things. You know, when you go 60 feet, do we understand what that means? That doesn't mean that you can't have 4 stories. It's just that 60 feet is pretty high for 4 stories.
So if
Yeah,
I
I mean,
could, to get
please.
back to, I think your question, which is all the stipulations that Bob just mentioned, which some of which are embedded in this text and some which are sort of implied coming down the road from the applicant because they talked about it, right? I'm guessing that all those stipulations could be also in an overlay zone text. So for me, it's what device do you use in order to move this project forward, right? But not just carte blanche, but move it forward in a way that has a process attached to it that yields the best result for not just the applicant and not the best result for the town, because you're gonna get neither if you try to get both. The optimum result for everybody. And so if this is the device that moves it forward most quickly, I think that's great, but not at the expense of, right, planning and design. And I think that's my primary concern. If you guys decide you wanna do an overlay zone, I'm all for it. Whatever zoning device you guys decide to use,
Okay.
that's your
Fine.
prerogative, right?
Okay.
I mean, you know, yield to Caesar, right? So that's where we are, and that's fine. That's the way it's supposed to work.
I don't
I don't
think
know
that's
that I like that
Yeah,
comparison,
Yeah, I'm not sure I like that.
Did somebody write that down? I hope.
No, don't write it.
Memorialized. So, I mean, I'm all for using whatever devices gets it done and gets it done well.
Okay.
And if this is the one, I'm good with it, but then we need to sort of make sure it's done well.
So I have kind of a maybe like remedial question about if and how does a special permit process vary from, say, an overlay zone?
I'm not the one.
I don't know that we need to talk, we can
If they're telling,
talk about that probably offline.
but I don't know, if they're telling us that the mechanism that's used is on us, I feel like we all need to have the same understanding of the process and
If I may,
Sure.
it may be helpful to think in terms of where you wanna, what the board is trying to accomplish on North Greeley. I've heard this board and prior town boards talk about their desire to make distinctions between the east side and the west side of North Greeley. The lots on the east side of North Greeley are tiny. Most of them, if you take the the Verizon building up to the post office.
Right.
They're about 1/10 of an acre each.
Mhm.
One of them is a little bit bigger.
Right.
If you combined all of them, you would just about be slightly bigger than the 50 North Greeley property. So that's a big difference in terms of what you're dealing with. The ones on the east side of the street back onto an existing townhouse development. So again, I know this board has wanted to make distinctions around those existing conditions. And if the board is still inclined to do that, I'd suggest that an overlay may not be the best approach.
okay,
Because
so an overlay
tends to
is,
be homogeneous in terms of its application. The town only has 3 overlay, correct me if I'm wrong, Sabrina and Jen, but we only have 3 overlay districts in the whole town. One's Chappaqua Crossing, one's an environmental overlay, and one's the Millwood Design Center that was.
You have the multifamily Chappaqua and multifamily.
Lots floating, oh, that's right, that's a floating.
Yeah, those are floatings, but
So,
overlays are.
There aren't many of them, and they tend to be
Much bigger
good
than-
when you want the same thing in an area.
so it's kind of the
Less
size.
to draw fine distinctions within a zone.
Okay, so that answers my question, that it's just really about the size of the
And I think, for example, going back to Lisa's earlier observation about this particular parcel, as opposed to what we have now in the opening of this legislation, those are the kinds of things I think that should be put in that opening paragraph that says, in addition to the things that you identified, you know, whatever constraints it has, it's kind of unique because I think it's in two different districts and this kind of stuff. But also, it's distinct from the east side. I mean, if you're going to make policy, I would make it on that basis. I mean, we sort of made the observation, we didn't mean it to be flip, but really to a large extent, a certain extent, some of the stuff contained in the proposed legislation is lifestyle, and we sort of like, it's sort of like a real estate brochure.
Yeah.
You know, you don't legislate that or put it in zoning, but what you do put in zoning to say is specifically, you want the east side to sort of stay that way for the reasons that Ed just articulated. It's up against a residential district, not a train track. It's you know, if you go 3-4 stories on that side, you're really gonna impact, you know, the condominium units up there. So I think those are the kinds of things to put in here to give you guys, all of us, not just the cover, but the reasoning and the basis for what we're doing for this parcel and the next parcel up north.
But that sounds
we
like what I
can-
was talking about when I said maybe we do a zoning amendment for North Greeley.
Yep.
And a special permit for 50 North Greeley.
I mean, it seems to me that
But you know, then we get back to all of the implications of that and having a lengthy secret process. But I think we could plan for that and, you know, get some basic facts and figures to sort of project what the parking and traffic might be if we do something like that, while still proceeding with the application.
Well, it sounds like
Does
we
that
need
make
to take the legislative issues into account first. It sounds like we need to figure out are we doing, let's just say for argument's sake, special permit. Okay, we all decided, special permit. Now knowing that that's how the direction we wanna proceed, how do we account for the planning board's issues with the legislation that account for now the fact that we're moving forward as a special permit?
So I'd like to make a recommendation. What is in the special permit specifically, right?
Okay,
First of all, I would not put in a special permit designation for one piece of property, what you can't do on another piece of property. I just don't.
I wouldn't say that I can't, but
Well, I don't think you
Make the
language, I wouldn't make the distinction because it stigmatizes the other side of the street and it sort of casts a pall.
I don't think
No, I
it's
would just- it's just like-
Okay, it casts a pall on it because the town is declaring that they don't want development on the
I
other side.
wouldn't,
No,
we
we're
wouldn't say that,
not.
but just a description of the differences.
Okay, I disagree, but we can get past
Okay.
that. I think that what is most important is the 4 stories, right? What else is important? Honestly, what else is important in this special permit legislation? Lifestyle stuff, no. Parking, maybe, but we'll hold on that until we understand what the parking is
Right.
going to be, right? The notion that this has the net zero carbon thing, I think that's all great. I'm not sure that belongs in a zoning text. I think that's belongs someplace else. I don't think you need that as justification for the special permit.
okay.
I put in there only what you need as justification for the special permit instead of attaching all sorts of other conditions and stipulations that then make it maybe more difficult for somebody to want to append that special district, come and appeal to make that special district part of, then you have to rewrite the text, I don't know.
Well, I would argue though, just getting back to the environmental part of it, on the exact same site, with the exact same building, if it was fossil fuel, you know, completely not environmentally sensitive, I don't know that I would be as excited about that project as I am knowing that it can be, that it's a net zero building, that it can be, that it's, because it's mass timber, it can be built off-site. So the impact on our town in terms of putting this up doesn't mean that our merchants are now gonna be sitting with construction for 2 years. That most of it is assembled off-site and brought over with a crane and just kind of stuck down, and it really limits the impact on our town. I think if those weren't included, I wouldn't be as excited to build a 4-story building that was completely,
Got it. I think those are
using
all-
oil and everything else. So I actually
I
do think
that
it
those
should
are
be
all
in there.
great things, but the premise you're making is that that wouldn't happen without it in the zoning text. And from everything I've heard from the applicant or the applicant's representative, is that this is something that he really wants to do.
But I think the point that you just raised, Lisa, is a really good one, and it's a question that I was going to ask, right? Because it also gets a little bit to Holly's question about what is the difference between overlay district and a special permit. An overlay district just rewrites what the zoning is, and then that's what's allowed as of right. A special permit is, there's the zoning that's in place, that's the as of right, that today is 2 stories, right, on this specific site. And then there's a special permit which says you can have these additional reliefs from zoning, whatever they may be, in exchange for X, Y, and Z. And there's a policy decision as to what are we trying to get in place, and it actually is very relevant because this property owner and this developer, right, there's 2 different entities, right, the property owner and the developer here, are looking to do a bunch of really awesome things, but life happens and they may sell the property tomorrow. And so if we don't put in place what we wanna get out of this, then we may not get that same thing out of it.
That makes sense.
Yes.
Right, and so-
Very true.
And so the special permit, there is, I mean, the word special exists for a reason. And it's because there's something unique that there is a little bit of a quid pro quo, like we're willing to give up something in exchange for something else that we want as a town, and that could be any number of things. And so the sustainability question, or the height question, or the parking question, or the process question, or any other possible things that are being proposed here, the affordable housing question, right, they're proposing 12%. Our town requirement is 10%, they're proposing above and beyond, but the next guy may not do that. So if we wanna give an extra story of height, which I think would be awesome, for more housing, more affordable housing, more green measures, then we should think about what's the best way to do that. The specificity of the language and how it's tailored to this site specifically, but might apply to other sites, that's where we kind of got tripped up. But I think the special permit can be, especially if we're only talking about one site, and not 2 sites, and not the east side, and not something else, the special permit makes to me much more sense for one site, this site, and
When you say one site, you mean just 50, or are you including the one north?
just 50.
Just 50.
Okay.
The one north, I don't know anything about it. I don't know if it could even, to Tom's point, the language is written,
Can you build that there?
covers the site to the north, but we have no idea if they can meet any of these requirements or would want to, or if it's even feasible. It's a much different site, just from a meets and bounds, right? It's so much longer and narrower.
That is a difficult site.
Right,
And that was one of our concerns, that by grouping it, we might be imposing standards on the next guy, the next
could
lot,
never
the
meet.
next
Well,
parcel,
that's a good point.
Right.
that we
Right.
can't meet, that they
Right.
couldn't meet, so that would really frustrate, again, North Greeley's development.
Is there a reason to include two of them in it when there's not a representative for the other property even asking?
I mean, there could be, if we decide that we'd be willing, just like any zoning, if we decide that we would be willing to give all these things on that site as well, it allows then the owner of that property to know, okay, well, this is now my zoning, I can build, let's say, 4 stories if I have the environmental, if I have 12% affordable housing, if I, have all these things in place. So it's just another mechanism of zoning, much like
But
it
it's
is
not
anywhere
coming
else.
from the applicant.
No, it's not,
Okay,
no.
it's not, because
So I'm convinced by you all, not that I need to be convinced, but I'm convinced by you all that this notion of getting the green building technology in there is a good thing.
Okay.
Yes, and I do think I like to see that, cause from my perspective, I really wanna make sure that something happens on
Yeah.
North Greeley.
Yep.
And I really love all of the green aspects of it. I just wanna make sure that we're not looking too narrowly and hamstringing anybody else for the future. 'Cause to some degree, I'm kind of picturing, like in the movie Up, when everything grows around and there's this little tiny house in the middle. I don't want us to make the east side doomed to that by a decision we make right now on one property. So that's kind of when you talk about from a planning perspective.
Right.
That I wanna make sure that we don't lose that picture either.
I'm also persuaded with Eldad's concept that we just look at this one particular parcel. We have an
I am too.
application,
Yes.
just look at the one application.
Yes.
And I think that will alleviate some of the concerns that are in here.
Okay.
Totally
So-
agree.
And
If we can do that, I mean, I think that makes great sense, and I think what it comes down to is, as Eldad said, it's quid pro quos. And we just have to make sure that, you know, whatever's being asked and whatever's being given comes out in balance, and we're not out of balance.
Mhm.
And that we still need that information, but I think this makes great sense.
I feel like we just answered two questions.
The one last thing I would say is on the green technologies, and if we're gonna put that in, and we should totally put that in, you know, it needs to have some sort of like the way it reads right now, it doesn't have any kind of reporting mechanism or anything that is actually holding them. It's a little more.
Or standards.
Exactly, I mean, it will be LEED gold certified, or it doesn't have to be, or equivalent, you know, we need to be able to demand certain standards. I don't know if we're actually talking to it, or I'm just using the word LEED, there's like 100 different ways to get there today.
Right.
But, you know, that's the kind of stuff we should ask for maybe.
So I think two things. I think first, and it might make sense to get a smaller group of the planning board and the town board together to wordsmith the actual verbiage in the legislation, to, you know, incorporate all these things we've discussed and then bring it back to the greater boards. I just think it's gonna be possible to do with the two full boards together. So I think that's important, and we should set up a time to do that and pick who you wanna do that. The other thing, and you asked it before, I just wanted to put it out there. I actually think that having retail or some kind of commercial space is very important. Because one of the concepts in the comprehensive plan was not just to increase our housing stock,
Yep.
was also to bring vitality to the hamlets. And you have, let's say, 50 new units. That's not bringing vitality. Yeah, those 50 people might be in town, but what we really want to do is actually bring people from the rest of town and other towns downtown. That's how you're going to increase vitality. And a way to do that, if we had, for instance, a fabulous diner or a great commercial, you know, store, whatever it is, that really is going to incentivize people to come down and even bring people to that end of North Greeley, that can even revitalize not only the hamlet, but the street as well. And I've heard from numerous residents as well as merchants that something like a diner that has lunch service and really can bring kids and families and everyone else is something that would really be welcome in town, which is why it's proposed. That being said, does the size necessarily need to be what was initially proposed? No, it could be a little smaller, and we've seen from the Chappaqua Diner that used to be there, that was very popular, did very well. And so we know in terms of sizing that can actually work. So if that even impacted parking and traffic, things like that, I think the developer would be willing to work to change the size of that. But in my view, that commercial/retail component is very important to bring the vitality into town.
Can I just from a planning perspective, 100%. Commercial at the ground floor, at this location, along North Greeley makes all the sense in the world. And it would be a mistake, from my perspective, to eliminate it in service of meeting a parking requirement that is decades old.
I'm just concerned about promising a diner. I don't know the extent to which we can control what kind of restaurant comes in there. We've seen at Chappaqua Crossing what trouble they've had attracting certain restaurants that they wanted. We could certainly say we want a diner. I know that the applicant is going to do their best to get that, but I'd be a little bit hesitant to promise that
No, that's true.
to the community.
But we can say a restaurant space.
We would like that.
Commercial,
like a diner.
retail.
Right, we definitely would.
Mhm.
I think
would
that
say-
would be
I mean,
fantastic, but
Whatever it is, I mean, I can't agree more that is something that we need to see. The applicant wants that. I think it makes great sense. But I think we have to recognize that it comes with potentially, until we have the information, it comes with some cost that may cause other issues and friction somewhere else. And specifically, we've talked about it at length, till we have that parking information, we need to know what that means. Because that, under our code, people are just throwing it out the window at this point, but I'm not so sure we can just throw it out the window without information.
So I imagine that the owner is going to work in complete good faith to get a restaurant, diner, however it gets, for as long as he can. And he may be successful, could very well be successful, but it could be one day where it sits vacant long enough that nobody wants a vacant space, and then there's an appeal to the town, there's a way to
Right.
sort of deal with that.
Right.
So I think it's a great goal, and I think that we ought to be pursuing it. I don't know the extent to which you want to legislate it, I'm not the
Right, we
zoning
can
guy.
figure that
Well,
out.
But
If I may, the way the text reads right now, it's any retail use permitted in that zone. It's not a diner, it's not necessarily a restaurant. The applicant is going to, build it, they'd say, to that specification, but the zoning doesn't mandate it.
Well, okay, we can talk about if
Yeah,
if
that's
there are
a
other
technical.
ways to amend that.
Right.
All right, so I think this has been really helpful. I think all these people are really not here to listen to us anymore. So I think we came to a few actually great conclusions today. First, that I believe we're saying yes, special use permit with environmental language in there, looking at the one site.
Mhm.
And we're going to get a small group together, you'll get back to me, to really look at the language in the legislation, kind of wordsmith that a bit,
Real standards.
Yeah.
there is,
and that we want commercial. Ed?
Yeah, if I may, let me suggest that my office and Sabrina work together on taking what was said tonight and
Yeah.
generating a first cut
Sure.
and then bring that back to the small group. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yes.
that's great,
so
love that,
Yes.
yes, thank you.
We welcome that.
So before we break up, getting back to your excellent list, there was one that we really didn't get to, which was sort of the procedures of application and review.
Mhm.
And we probably don't have time for that tonight, but I think that's a real serious thing we ought to be taking a look at.
Maybe take 30 seconds and say like your concern with the, it's like the last line in the proposed legislation. If that's okay, I just think that it is an important piece. I know it's particularly
I think this is the same, I think I was looking for the same answer when I asked about the process and how it might differ, so I'd actually like to hear what you think.
So this particular special permit text, unless I'm mistaken, in our experience, and I think it's typical for these kinds of things, that the town board retains authority in these things, and the planning board is consulted, but it's ultimately, because it's a special permit, it's a special zoning thing, so you guys do it, right? There's something about these processes which I think that is, for me, helpful to remember, is that there's what you build, and then there's how you build it. And the what you build is like the policy stuff, the zoning stuff. We want 4 stories, we want all these special attributes, and that makes it a special permit. That's our vision, is the use of this thing. Then there is the design of it, and the design of it is the execution of that policy, right? So, and that, to me, is not the province, for me, that's not the province of a town board, that's a province of a planning board, people who do this for a living and have the experience of actually knowing what to look for and the principles of town planning and how to make it sort of all come together. In between the policy and the design is something called planning, right? And I think that we should be working together on the planning of it like we are now. But I think that when it comes time for the special, not the special, but for the typical site plan approval, review and approval, I think it ought to go through the planning board. I really think that it ought to be in the planning board's hands to do that. And so, I mean, that's my 30-second pitch, and we can come back to that some other time.
I'll just throw this out, can it be done jointly?
Well, the reviews could be done jointly, but the final, I don't know if you can have a 10 person vote on an application.
Mhm.
That would be truly jointly. I think it needs to be in the hands of one board versus the other. And I think it ought to be under the authority of the planning board because we're constituted to do that. And we've demonstrated perfectly well that we could do it perfectly well. You haven't seen yet the neighborhood that's being built up there because it's not built yet, but it's in process. We designed that, right? It used to be just a cluster of buildings with like garages. We turned it into a real neighborhood with neighborhood streets. This is before Toll Brothers came in. And Toll Brothers arrived and they bought the property and they bought that site plan. They had no objections to it. And they're the premier home builders. I'm making obviously an advertisement for us.
But that
But I
was
feel like
part
I
of a
have to.
whole
They may have had one or
preliminary
two
development
objections.
concept plan, like I don't know
What's the
that we've
difference?
ever done anything like that before.
But the outcome was good,
No, the outcome was definitely good.
yeah, and the outcome
Well,
can be
we'll see.
good.
Well, I'd say
I don't
that
like to extend this
I don't
day.
know
It's
it's
bad
good,
yet.
I'm kidding, I'm kidding.
I'd say that the legislation as proposed takes authority away from the planning board, and that's just something that should be considered, right? I mean, it's not just to be taken as written, and we should think about it, and what is the proper
I don't disagree.
Understood.
I don't
Let's talk
disagree.
about it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm certainly comfortable with the policy aspect and planning aspect, and I think we should think about what you said.
Definitely.
Yeah, we will definitely talk about that.
Great,
and
that's all
consider
I'm
it.
saying.
Perfect.
Thank
Good.
you.
All right,
On to your next project.
so yes, so can I have a motion to adjourn our joint meeting?
Motion to adjourn our joint meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
So we need a motion to adjourn our special meeting as well, or something?
So moved.
Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Okay,
All
thank
right,
you.
thank you guys
Yeah.
again,
Thank you
and
very much.
Eldad didn't hear, but I really love these meetings, and I think we can get a
I
lot
see
done
it right at
together.
the
It's in
top.
there.
Yeah, it's in here.
It's
The
in the
love
text.
language wasn't in there,
Oh.
but yes. I ad-libbed a little.
I do too.
not
All right, hello, everybody. Welcome to our town board meeting of Tuesday, January 24th, 2023. Can I please have a motion to open the town board meeting?
I move to open the town board meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Before we get started with the reason I know most of you are here, we have just some preliminary items. Announcements, are there any announcements? You guys?
Yes. I do have one announcement. I'd just like to remind everybody that Tuesday, January 31st is the last day to pay the second half school taxes without penalty. So we just encourage you, if you are responsible to pay your taxes as opposed to your bank, please be sure to either come in or drop off your payment before then. If you choose to mail it, be sure you witness a US postmark being affixed to it. Don't simply drop it at a post office or in a mailbox. The penalty is 10%. So 10% if you're one day late, and really it's so upsetting to see people come in and have to accept that. So please come in and pay your taxes. We'll be here from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.
And you can submit a post-dated check if you would like to as well.
Absolutely. You can post date your check for whatever date you like, and we hold it until that date and don't deposit it before then. So please. Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of a supervisor's report, most of it will be in the newsletter tomorrow. Just a couple things. First, I want to wish a happy Lunar New Year to all who celebrate. And also, this weekend, we are having the Town of Newcastle's Committee on Race, Equity and Inclusion is partnering with the PTA and their Diversity, Race and Belonging Committee, the library, and the Horace Greeley BIPOC Student Union for an I Have a Dream celebration, which is a day of celebration with a peace walk, as well, and followed by a panel discussion. So that's on the 29th. There'll be information in the supervisor's report and on Facebook. So we would love to see all of you there in attendance. And then in early February, we're having our Lunar New Year celebration at the Chappaqua Performing Arts Center, as well as a dance troupe there. So we hope you all participate. Community Corner, we have a couple of birthday announcements to announce. The first is happy 8th birthday to Georgie Rosen. Happy 10th birthday to Darren Post. Happy birthday to Easton Kaplow. And a very happy birthday to Vicky Lang Bergstrom. So thank you. Your names will also be in the supervisor's report tomorrow. And the community would like to wish you a very happy birthday. Again, if anyone has anything they would like to announce, a community announcement, please email it to communitycorner@mynewcastle.org. All right, so now we're gonna just open the microphone for any public comment or new business not related to the public hearing for this evening. Anything new? Okay, is there anyone online? Okay, I'm gonna take that as a no. Earlier this evening, by the way, we had a work session and our state senator, Pete Harcum, arrived via Zoom. So if anyone's interested in what we discussed, I urge you to watch the YouTube replay of that. All right, so we are now going to open our public hearing on the Wright Guest House at Chappaqua Crossing. So we're gonna have presentations, I believe, by the applicant, by Toll Brothers, and I think Summit Greenfield, as well as Gray Williams is here from the Historical Society to talk about it. So can I just give a,
There should be a motion to open public.
okay, so first can I have a motion to open the public hearing?
I move to open the public hearing.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, so do you wanna give a,
I can just give a brief summary as to how we got here. The public hearing relates to the application to take down the guest house. That came into the town by letter last year, April 21. It was part of a really a four-part request. The guest house was one of those requests. The town board had work sessions on June 7th, June 28th, June 26th, July 26th, where it talked about the guest house aspect of the application. At the July 26th work session, you asked the applicant to provide some more information, which it did by letter dated October 12th. All of those materials were posted to the town website, including the original application materials. On October 18th, the town board adopted a resolution declaring its intent to be lead agency under SECRA. The proposed action, again, relating to the guest house, was referred to the Westchester County Planning Department. We did receive back a letter from the Planning Department, so that's also online and in the packet tonight. In December, the board circulated a notice of intent, and earlier this month scheduled a public hearing, which brings us to tonight.
Okay, perfect. And I just wanted to highlight, so for those of you who may not know, so the guest house, if you drive into the Chappaqua Crossing site from 117, it's immediately to your right, that White House. And currently, it is proposed to be utilized as part of the Toll Brothers development, as part of, I guess, a recreational facility that they were going to build. They have now, asked us to relieve them from that, so that's where we are today. But I think there was just a little confusion we saw online. It was never going to be just a standalone house that was sitting there. Right now, it is contemplated as part of the site plan in the Toll Brothers development. So they have asked us not to have to maintain that at this point, and that is the subject of this public hearing today. So I think, why don't we start by hearing from the applicant as to what your want is, and then Gray will hear from you.
All right, well, thank you. So my name is Diana Kolev. I'm from the firm of Del Bello, Donnell, Weingarten, Wise, and Whitaker. And so I'm here tonight on behalf of CLS Chappaqua Fee.
Yeah.
No,
Closer.
right, okay. So CLS Chappaqua Fee owner, which is the successor to the master developer of this mixed-use project known as Chappaqua Crossing, and also with the consent of KL Toll Fort, which is the related company of Toll Brothers that's now developing the East Village residential component of Chappaqua Crossing. So tonight, you'll see you have Felix Charney and David Walsh here as well from CLS. There's also David Ball, an architect, from the Monroe Partnership, as well as Jason Godley, the senior project manager for Toll Brothers. So thank you for putting that up. So as you mentioned earlier, and I know it's hard to see over here, but the guest house is right here, this is where it currently exists, next to this amenity center over here. So, thank you. No, that's all. So as you know, Chappaqua Crossing has been under development for many years. We've been before your board and the planning board numerous times to amend the secret findings and the associated plans. And so this is the Wright Guest House that was originally part of the Reader's Digest headquarters. The preservation of that guest house has been the preference in the past. However, the guest house is located, as you mentioned, right in the middle of a resident amenity space for the new 91 townhome luxury community that is currently under construction, and the constraints and costs of the preservation and adaptive reuse of the existing guest house have become a real issue. So as you mentioned, we did make a submission to request that you eliminate the condition, or the planning board eliminate the condition that required the preservation of the guest house and corresponding amendments to the secret findings. So in lieu of the adaptive reuse of the guest house, what the applicant is proposing is to construct a new clubhouse building that emulates the exterior design characteristics of the guest house. If you could just go forward two slides. One more. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. So it would emulate the exterior design characteristics of the guest house, and the new clubhouse would deliver essentially an identical facade to maintain the historic look of the guest house, but would better meet the needs and the desires of the new East Village residents at a more appropriate cost. So there would be no change to the existing building footprint or limits of disturbance. It would really just go in the same spot as the existing guest house. And as Mr. Ball, our architect, will explain, preservation of the guest house is, as it had been previously discussed, is really a very expensive undertaking that in this instance does not really make sense. It's located on a private property and it will not be open to the public. We're really only talking about the facade that is visible. The foundation is likely to become unstable, and the numerous renovated additions and renovations to the guest house over the years have really greatly diminished its historic value. But as we submitted in our materials, any interior items that are deemed historic, such as floors and moldings, can be removed and salvaged to be used elsewhere or in the new building that will be constructed. You'll also hear from Jason Gottlieb, who will explain that the existing guest house is really going to be more of a burdensome maintenance issue for the homeowners association that is going to take over this project once it's completed. And the heating and cooling and other maintenance costs of a renovated or repurposed guest house is really going to be at a minimum 25% more as compared to a new structure. So, and as your attorney pointed out, the town board has reestablished its lead agency status. So what we ask from the board tonight is once you've heard from everyone tonight, if you you would consider closing the public hearing and considering the requested amendments. So I'm gonna just turn it over to Mr. Ball over here.
Good evening, everyone. It's been a while since I've been in front of this board. So I'm David Ball, principal of the Monroe Partnership. We're an architecture firm that's been involved with this overall project for many years. Last September, I was asked to look at the guest house, look at the historic importance of it, and also what kind of condition it's in. And, the basic conclusion is that originally it was a very nice farmhouse, probably built in the mid-1800s, late 1800s. And in my report, I kind of mentioned it was probably late Georgian style, but it's kind of a simplified version of that. So if the original Reader's Digest building is a good example of Georgian, this is sort of a toned down version of it. We did look, and it is not on the National Register of Historic Places. And unfortunately, over the years, with various renovations and additions, it has kind of lost its original presence and quality architecturally. So if you could go, please, a couple slides. One more, right there. So at the top photograph is basically the original building. With that said, on the right side, the porch that you see with very tall columns, we don't think is original. That was probably built in the 1960s, and Dave Walsh will talk a little bit about that afterwards. And then also the windows, which are a little bit tough to see in the photograph, but those are the original windows likely. They're single pane windows and they're covered with storm windows, which sort of diminishes their character. And by the way, that would be a necessary thing moving forward to have those. The roof elements, right now the roof is in decent shape, but it's an asphalt roof, which is unlikely the original roof. It probably would have been either slate or wood shake shingles. And also on the roof, if maybe go one more slide, please. I'm sorry, so this slide is a close-up of the columns in that porch addition at the south end of the building that's more or less facing the entryway of the overall site. Those clearly are not original. And so that's why we came to that conclusion. Next slide, please. So there's been several additions. On the top slide, you see what I'll describe as a carriage house that was likely built in the 1960s. Also, on the bottom is, they built sort of a meeting area with a commercial kitchen. What you see in the middle is the commercial kitchen. To the right is the meeting room. Next slide, please. These, a couple more slides of, again, on the bottom, on the right side is the carriage house, on the left side is the meeting room and commercial kitchen. And so, and there's a couple other details, like, for example, up on the roof, there is a mechanical screen, which is obviously not original equipment. There's a couple flat roof dormers on the top of the building, the original house, which is unusual. Could be the original, it's hard to say. It's unusual for that architectural style, but let's say it was there as part of perhaps a farmhouse. But really what, I think the main point is all these additions over the years. Also, on the next slide there, I'll go ahead to the next slide. One more if you don't mind. Keep going. And keep going, there's more than I thought. And Dave, I could talk about this, but afterwards, because there's a couple slides of the interior afterwards. So, but these are a couple slides of work that was done in the mid-80s. And basically, and you go one more slide, please. You can see that they replaced all the siding, they clearly repaired quite a bit of the trim. And not to say they didn't do a good job and they didn't maintain the character of what was there originally. But the combination of, all these additions, all these kind of 1960s add-ons, such as the porch, has really diminished the character of the building. Next slide, please. And again, another renovation picture, then the next slide. So on the interior of the building, a little bit tough to see. Actually, the bottom left picture, you can see the, on the right side of that, that's the original staircase. Great old staircase, but the paint is really in the worst condition I've ever seen paint. It is really peeled, it's sticking out, an inch or so out of the wall everywhere. And the concern is that that's probably lead paint. So to bring that back to life would be a real, it would be a very expensive proposition. And, the floors of the building are in very good shape, but the, like I said, and by the way, the molding is nice, but that's also covered with lead paint and it's not in great shape. So we're looking at, what was originally a farmhouse, relatively small building, small rooms. For example, on the upper pictures, they kind of combined what probably was a living room and a dining room, and they added a new opening. And so really Jason will talk a bit about the viability of the use, but ultimately trying to take what was a house, relatively small house, low ceilings, and turn it into sort of a high-end community center would be a challenge. So I spoke a bit about the lead paint. That clearly is an issue. Secondly, in the basement, there's asbestos on the pipes, and that's going to be very expensive to remove that. Also, the upper floor, which really, the ceilings are low, which is a challenge for the new use. But there's no way of using the upper floor for handicap accessibility, so that's going to be a challenge. And turning this from a residential building into a commercial building creates a number of issues. One is, even if you had to reuse just one wall, in commercial architecture, the new energy code requires a couple things. One of which is continuous insulation. So back in the day, you would build studs, you put, actually, it would be plywood or other, board sheathing, which is probably what this home is made out of. Nowadays, you're required to add insulation with plywood on the outside, and that's what you put the siding onto. And so effectively, you have to take down the wall, except for the studs, take down the windows, and rebuild the wall. So reusing this as a commercial building for the exterior walls will be a challenge. The windows being single pane do not meet the energy code also. So that would be a challenge as far as if you brought in new windows, which could look very much like the old ones, that would meet the code. But if you use the existing ones, you'd have to put storm windows on the outside, same condition that the building's in now, that it would diminish the look of the windows. There's also mold in the basement that would have to be remediated. And then lastly, structurally, the existing foundation wall is stone rubble with mortar. It's got a number of challenges. There's several areas where they've sent pipes through the wall to the additions, and that was done in such a way that is structurally unstable. There's questions about, if you're building a new building these days, you have to put reinforcement bar in the walls. And that there's lateral loads from wind and earthquakes, and that's what stops that from, those walls from, falling apart. And the stone wall, in order to make this a commercial building, you'd really probably have to put concrete on the inside with rebar, which would be prohibitively expensive to do. And also now you're creating new floor loads on the existing floor. So in commercial space, it's basically how much weight you're putting on the floor. That would end up being a much higher load. So you'd have to add structure underneath, more beams, more columns, and that would be, fairly expensive to do. So the combination, and also the columns are rusting at the bottom, they'd probably have to be replaced. So you're talking about asbestos, lead paint, redoing the structure, energy code issues, all these things to make this existing house built in the 1850s viable as a commercial use is really a challenge. And beyond that, and Jason can talk about that a little bit, is that the house as it stands is really not appropriate for what they're doing. They're low ceilings, small rooms, makes it very difficult for them to work with. So that's basically, in a nutshell, our analysis of the existing building and how to use it moving forward. So Dave Walsh?
Yeah. Hi, my name is David Walsh. I've been on board with Summit Development since about 2004. Prior to 2004, I was Director of Corporate Facilities for the Reader's Digest Association. And one of my specific responsibilities was the guest house and the operations. Over those years, there was many things that happened up there. People who have memories of the guest house was mostly through the parties that they had thrown up there. So there's only a real small handful of people who ever got to have a party up there, and I'm glad to say that I was certainly one of them. As we were preparing for this meeting, I called an old colleague who began his career at the Reader's Digest in 1962. If we can go forward one screen, please. Back. I'm sorry, back. Right there. So I contacted this old colleague, and he told me where I might be able to find some information in an archive room that is in the lower level of the Digest. Sure enough, there was an old folder in a file room that had a handful of these Polaroids, which I copied and sent out, today to our team so they can look at them. What he had indicated to me, and again, he was there in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. I believe he left, I think, at about 2001. He indicated to me that there was significant renovations in the 60s, 70s, and this last large one, like being in 1987. And he recalls that the porch was built in the 60s, and then in the 70s, the other additions were added on to, and then the 80s, they basically did the entire facade of the building and renovated it from there. If you can move forward a couple of slides. I think what's important to note is right in here. When you look at the basement here, you can see, over the years, and certainly that those pipes and the asbestos on those are pre-70s, so that all of that work was done back probably in the sixties. Because they're all asbestos covered, but the way that things were just haphazardly knocked through the stone wall, to Dave's point, structurally certainly weakened the structure. And I think that's really important for everybody to kind of see, and how this would be adaptively reused, and how problematic that really is in terms, for Toll Brothers and the luxury community that they're building. I also think that, when you look at the existing structure, converting it now into a commercial use for a community center or whatever else they're gonna be using it for, when you look at these low ceiling heights and so on and so forth, it's just, it just doesn't really fit for what ultimately a commercial building should be. But I just wanted to add those couple of things that I had in how we came across these new pictures that haven't been seen before, because they've been stuck in the archive room down at Chappaqua Crossing, formerly the Reader's Digest Association. So that's it for me. I'll turn it over to Jason.
Hi, good evening. Jason Gottlieb, Senior Project Manager with Toll Brothers. So, from Toll's perspective, there's kind of three key aspects to this. One is, we broke ground on the project about a year ago or so. We have a little north of a dozen units under contract at this point. Our model building is nearly complete. If you've driven through the complex, we just recently landscaped that, and will be anticipated opening. The model homes will be open sometime next month. So a lot of our buyer demographic is downsizing from 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 square foot homes that they've had to maintain to this luxury townhome development. And one of those draws is the kind of low maintenance or lack of maintenance as part of these communities, right? No snow removal, no landscape removal. And we create these associations. Toll is on the board, and at some point.
Sorry, people can't hear you. Can you just maybe move the microphone a little closer?
Can you hear me better now?
Can everyone hear better? Yes, okay.
So as part of these associations that we set up for these townhome communities, Toll creates these boards, and then we transition the boards over to the homeowners association, which is made up of residents within the community. And based on the feedback that we've been getting from our buyers, to take on an existing structure like this that requires a great deal of rehab and is not really in keeping with a luxury townhome development. It's just something that would be burdensome to the association. So that's one of the components to this discussion. The other aspect here is that we've made commitments to the Attorney General's office as part of our offering plan to our buyers, which one has certain time constraints in terms of developing this clubhouse structure, and two, in terms of the programming of what that structure is gonna include. So, an older structure like this, David spoke about the floor heights, the constraint of some of the spaces. I think there's a picture up of the stairwell, which is incredibly narrow. That's not generally, it's not something that's in keeping with an amenity structure for a project that we've built. So I think those are kind of the key aspects from our seat. I think
So I'm just gonna, you'd be surprised if I didn't wanna add something, right? I mean, I didn't drive down from Connecticut just to sit here, and some of you I don't even know. So for to your good fortune, you haven't had to deal with me since 2004. I'm Felix Charney. I'm the principal of Summit Development, who purchased this from Reader's Digest in 2004. And as Lisa can tell you, I am like a sore that just will never go away. It doesn't matter what you put on it, it's still here. However, I'm a person who keeps his promises. And I think Lisa, who at one point was a wonderfully lovely foe, would now tell you that I've been an honorable partner in the development and the adaptive reuse of the Reader's Digest project. It's been a very painful, time-consuming and expensive process that we've all gone through together. But as Tom was saying, who was here a little bit earlier, and he was taking credit for the perfection of the Toll site plan, I will tell you that the Toll site plan was kind of an afterthought. All of our energies were focused really on the retail and getting Whole Foods in town and making that work, and everything else kind of followed after that. Ironically, it isn't bad, but not everything was hyperanalyzed. And as we've been here since 2004, we've learned different things. And I have really actually come back very few times to ask for modifications to the original 159 conditions that were put upon me in 2015 and subsequently in 2018. And my position is there are certain things that we did and we did right. And there are certain things we did with good intentions. And there's certain things that we did where we maybe went too far. But at the end of the day, it kind of all works. And it all works, and it works as a result of all of our hard work. We were asked from the very beginning of this project, and we didn't have to be asked, that the cupola, which is an iconic feature in the county of Westchester, was something that needed to be saved. Little known fact, that's where Whole Foods was first going. They were doing an adaptive reuse of the cupola building because they thought it was cool. And I knew it was my responsibility to maintain that. At that time, and up until this whole issue with the guest house evolved, there was really no other feature on that property that we were told that we really needed to cherish. And so we always had politely a different opinion of the value of the guest house. And David articulated the 5 additions. I got to go to one of those parties. It's probably because I paid Reader's Digest all the money I did all those years ago. They invited me to it. It's a building that once may have been something, but through all the years, it became something else. And I think what we're trying to do today, or when the condition that was placed upon us, is to take that round peg and fit it into a square hole. I don't know if people on this board or members of this in this town hall are going to be Toll residents, but people are moving there for a quality of life, to stay in a community they love and embrace, to have a non-maintenance lifestyle. And unfortunately, the condition that's been placed upon us to preserve a small portion of this building, I think politely is a bit of an overreach. And we're smarter, we're wiser, and we're suggesting that there's a whole host of reasons why there's a better way. We will give you what you asked for. It will look the same, but it won't fall down. And it will be functionally correct. So I've come back for the couple of times and I've said, hey, I don't think we thought this through as clearly as we should. And I'm asking you guys to think about that again. And I know many of you have gone through the building and may or may not agree with me that it isn't exactly as special as maybe a home that deserves to be preserved. So with respect to our friends in historic, we don't think it's a house that ultimately deserves the level of attention that's being put upon us. And we're asking you to look at it slightly differently with the knowledge that we've all gained through all of these years and find a better way. Just as we have recently changed all of the ways we live by all the lessons that we've recently learned. That's my request. And I think, Lisa, I'm pretty sure, I don't want to be held to this, this may be the last time you get to mess with me.
Why? Because I'm leaving or you're leaving?
Oh, well, well, if you're leaving, I'm hoping that I'm leaving. I'm tired. When we started this project, I used to fondly tell people that I'm not old enough to qualify to live in the 55 and over community that we were proposing, that Janet Wells suggested we build. I'm not old enough to live in that community. I may come back and ask you guys to do assisted living because I am old enough and now qualified to live in that. But on a serious note, nice to meet the new folks and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else for this side of the issue? I have one quick question. I'm not sure who to address it to. And I know it's late in the process and I will preface it with the fact that I have not actually thought this through. But I like to just kind of noodle on things. If a decision was made that we wanted to keep the guest house as it is there a way that either it could somehow be taken out of, Ed's gonna kill me for asking this, but I'm asking anyway. Is there a way that it could either be somehow be taken out and deeded over to the town or the historical society or something like that? and find another place to put that clubhouse? Is that even a remote possibility? Rather than basically readapt it, is basically just to take it and give it away.
So I think Toll would be thrilled to be able to replicate the building in its current place and build a proper contemporary functional clubhouse to meet the needs of its new residents. If the town wants to take what's left of that building and move it somewhere, God bless you. You might wanna take it over to some of those lots I gave you on Roaring Brook Road that I gave you all a long time ago, and you haven't figured out what to do with them. But the only thing that would work is you need to go up there, you need to call the guys from Nantucket to move houses and just to haul it down the road if you wanna do that. I don't wanna go through any process that's a change to the site plan, not to mention that Jason, he now answers to a higher level, cause he's got an AG filed plan with those guys that would probably require an amendment, but you know, if you, over the objection of Jason, if you wanna take the house and move it and we replace it as discussed in the exact same footprint, that might work, but I'm sure Ed is rolling his eyes at the 474 permutations that would be required. That's what I like about you, Alicia, you're just like me, you think outside the box.
Move it. Alright, that was, does anyone have questions for the applicant while we're here, before we move over to Gray? Alright, so Gray,
Yeah, coming.
Okay, well, for little me, we have to move this down. This,
can you help him with that? It shouldn't be so hard.
can you do it?
We'll let the expert.
That's good for you? Well, let's move it down a little further,
Okay,
so I don't ping.
okay.
There we go.
Alright, that's good.
And let's see how, there you go.
Alright, perfect, thank you.
Is this really directional now? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Gray Williams. I'm speaking mainly of the, as town historian. I live at 376 Quaker Road. And I have been a Newcastle resident off and on since 1937. I wrote a longer form, but it's getting late, so I'm gonna shorten it. But it is important for you to know that this is not a new issue. I'm going to send you by email my long form, which I hope you'll look at. And I've already sent you the history of the building and a description of its main historic features. But I do need, for this hearing, to summarize how far back this issue goes. In 2009, Felix Charney of Summit Greenfield declined to consent to landmark designation, but promised to preserve both the guest house and the headquarters building. The headquarters building has indeed been preserved and successfully adapted for reuse. But the part of the property intended for residential development, including the house, was sold to Toll Brothers, and in 2019, Toll Brothers applied for permission to demolish the building and erect a clubhouse in its place. The planning board rejected this request. Toll Brothers then proposed to remove the entire interior of the house, which the firm was legally entitled to do. Planning board granted this request with conditions to protect the exterior during the process. Meeting these conditions promised to be exorbitantly expensive, so Toll Brothers withdrew the proposal. The firm's architectural consultant provided a plan for adaptive reuse of the building that required minimal alteration of either the exterior or interior. I was under the impression, perhaps mistaken, that Toll Brothers had accepted this plan up until late 2021. In any event, April 20 2022, Toll Brothers again requested permission to demolish the house, and this time has offered to erect a replica in its place, and here we are. Okay. Most of what I'm basing my analysis on is in letters and exhibits of October 9th. There are a couple of more things that have come up since, which I'll try to get to as well. First of all, the proposal supposes that the reproduction would be an acceptable substitute for the real thing. But of course, it just would not be, any more than a piece of reproduction furniture would be an acceptable substitute for a genuine antique or a studio copy for an original work of art. An authentic historic building would be replaced by the equivalent of a stage set. On this, the historic preservation community is unanimous. Some people feel even more strongly about it than I do. But that is basic. The replica idea just doesn't fly. Likewise, the Toll Brothers offer to include salvaged boards and other remnants of the building in the facsimile, and that is not an acceptable alternative to preserving the building itself. In its most recent letter to the town, Toll Brothers utilizes a report which has been summarized this evening to defend its proposal for demolition. The report commences by pointing out that the building is not on the National Register of Historic Places. Of course not. The owners wouldn't consent. Otherwise, the house would be a Newcastle landmark and virtually certain for inclusion in the state and national registers as well. Since I wrote that, I just found out that in fact it has been declared eligible by the state Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Once it's eligible, it means that if an application is presented in proper order and the owners consent, it'll go on. It has been declared. This goes most recently in 2020. There was a letter of resolution signed by Mr. Charney that stipulates that the headquarters building and this house are to be preserved. There is really no question of its historic importance. And we would have no trouble getting it on the National Register, and I think it would easily qualify. The report goes on to argue that the exterior has lost so many of its original Georgian-style elements that it's no longer authentic. But the house is not Georgian and never was. It's a fine example of vernacular federal architecture of the first half of the 19th century. And its spare decoration is in keeping with the Quaker traditions of the community. The report then argues that the house has undergone so many alterations over the years that it is no longer historic. This judgment is completely contrary to the accepted standards for historic significance. All old buildings have necessarily undergone changes over the years, but the alterations to this house haven't compromised its essential integrity. A major reason why this building is so important is that it has changed so much less than others of its age, including several of our recognized landmarks. The most significant alteration was the addition of the pillared front porch. And I think the evidence is quite plain. It was constructed by the Lawrence family about 1928. Presumably to increase its prominence at the entrance of a new village they hope to establish there. The porch is old enough to be considered historic in itself, and contrary to the report, its slender columns are in keeping with the federal style of the house. Finally, the report maintains that since the foundation of the building is of mortared stone rather than concrete reinforced by steel rebar, it is structurally unsound and in danger of collapse. But virtually all residential buildings up to the early 20th century have such foundations, and they pose no such threat. There are 53 landmark buildings in Newcastle, and all but a few have mortared stone foundations. More than half of those, 29, are as old or older than this house, and they're not collapsing. However, this is a very serious issue. At the very least, the town building inspector should be asked to report on the condition of the foundation. It would be even more desirable, and there's precedent for this, that an engineering firm agreeable to both the town and Toll Brothers evaluate the foundation and to specify what measures might be needed to protect it. Perhaps most important, the report echoes the Toll Brothers' claim that the preservation and maintenance of the building would cause unacceptable hardship to the future owners of the residential development. This claim should not be accepted without verifiable evidence. Precisely how much more would it cost to adapt the building rather than demolish and build a new one in its place? Precisely how much more would it cost to operate the adapted building rather than a new one? And precisely how much of a burden would each owner of the 91 projected units of luxury housing have to bear? Would that burden really amount to severe hardship? The preamble of the Town Historic Preservation reads as follows. It's hereby declared as a matter of public policy that the protection, enhancement, and perpetuation of historic properties is necessary to promote the economic, cultural, educational, and general welfare of the public. That's the real issue here. The Wright House is a demonstrably historic building. It would unquestionably be designated a Newcastle landmark if its owners would consent. It's important for several reasons. The first and foremost is its rarity. Houses of this age and in such good condition are uncommon, and those that survive deserve preservation for that reason alone. Almost as important is the quality of its architecture. The federal style, with its emphasis upon simplicity, symmetry, and graceful proportion, has long been popular in this country. It's the chief inspiration for what we call the colonial style, which is still widely favored. This house is a particularly fine and representative example. In terms of local history, the site commemorates two prominent early families in Newcastle, the Fowlers and the Wrights. The heritage of the Wrights is particularly significant because their properties remained undivided for so long. They were large enough to provide the sites of both the Reader's Digest and the Horace Greeley High School. In more recent times, the house reflects Lila Atchison Wallace's devotion to American history and the arts. And finally, the house has long been a handsome and highly visible feature of the community, and its loss would be sorely felt. I therefore urge the town board not to overrule the resolution of the planning board or its own resolution, but to confirm it and to adhere to the principles of our historic preservation law. I also urge Toll Brothers to accept the feasible plan for adaptive reuse of the building. And that was my prepared statement. There are a few things that have come up this evening. First of all, it was pointed out that it's going to be on private property. I would say a good 3/4 of our landmarks are on private property. That is an irrelevant issue completely. Roofs have to be replaced. The fact that it's not the original shapes, again, is irrelevant. It would not be considered something that you would hold against the property as being historic. The little dormers on top were added by the Reader's Digest. But of course, the Reader's Digest history up until 73 would be considered historic too. In fact, as I have just found out that the Reader's Digest site, the whole thing, has been accepted for eligibility as a historic district by the state. Now they're going over this question of the house, but there's no question that what was done by the digest is part of the history of this. It's relevant. Most of the additions that they pointed out in the slides are going to be removed anyway. They're not part of the house at all. The only main addition is the front pillars, and the evidence from old maps and so forth is clear that they were that front porch was put on in 1928, and the Lawrences had it. I've been around long enough to remember it from my childhood. Those pillars had been there. They weren't added later on by the digest. Lead paint is an issue, but again, I think you have to know precisely how much it will take to remove it. They describe this as a commercial building, but that, as I understand it, is not what this building is going to be. And the requirements for a store or a real commercial building would be rather different. I don't know how they arrive at that distinction. Finally, Lisa, I'm sorry, but you can't just move the building. It would be impractical, and that destroys a good half, if not 2/3, of its historic value.
Yeah, I wasn't actually talking about moving the building, I was talking about just segregating that
Oh.
building from the area and just taking it.
Ideally, that should have happened originally. If this property had been carved out, indeed, it probably could have been, without any difficulty, found a customer to make use of it as an office building or as some sort of center, that whole corner used for commercial purposes. It could have been a restaurant, it could be offices there, and I can imagine any number. But once it became part of this residential development, that became impossible. I feel sympathetic to a certain extent with Toll Brothers. I know they don't like this building. They don't want to use it. It would suit their needs better to build something to their own desires. But the public interest has to be considered here. And that I put forward is what really matters here. Okay, that's it. I'd welcome questions.
Any questions for Gray?
Well, that was very thorough. So, and I
As
read.
I say,
I
I've
read
sent
all
you
of
some
your,
documents,
your
I'll send you some more.
submissions. So I appreciate all the information that you've sent us.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
I said that I've read all of your submissions and it's been very thorough, so I don't have any questions at this time, but I know where to reach you.
Yeah.
So I will certainly go over everything again.
All right.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'll leave it to the next.
So,
I just
Yes.
have one comment. Thank you, Mr. Williams.
Hey, Bear.
In terms of, we certainly agree that in 2009, our partnership declined to register the guest house or any part of the property of Chappaqua Crossing. But it's also important to note that, at least in my tenure there at Reader's Digest, when I worked for Reader's Digest, they were approached twice to landmark the main cupola building and the guest house, and they declined. They declined many times over their 70-year tenure there to landmark anything on that property. I don't think that should make us any different than any other private property owner, just because we declined to have something registered. There's a lot of historical homes that are not on the National Registry because they don't want to register them on that registry. So I just think that that's important to note, that Reader's Digest declined it many times before. We declined it once.
If I may, there's no question that the Reader's Digest and commercial owners of property tend to resist being on the National Register because they feel that it will affect their plans to do something else with the property. That's not the point here. The point is that a promise was made to preserve these buildings, and it was kept, in the case of the Cupola building, admirably, but not this house. It got overlooked.
All right, thank you. Before we open this up for public comment, because we want to hear from everyone here, I just want to note that we did receive a number of written comments. Those are in the public record. And no one on this board has made a decision in our minds about what's going to happen here. So certainly any comments you have are going to be well taken by the board. So with that being said, I'd like to open it up to public comments. Come on up, give us your name and address when you come up, please. Any comments?
Maybe I can tilt this up, and do you hear me enough? Or I should go higher?
You can take it out too.
We'll just take turns between tall and less tall.
You can take it out of the stand as well.
Okay. You hear me good now? Bill Spade, architect, live on Brevoort Road here in Chappaqua. Have done projects on historic homes. You're even aware of a project we're trying to complete now on King Street. That project's being done by a not-for-profit organization who has struggled with affording to recreate the Quaker Meeting House that was there. And we've worked with Gray on how to do that adaptive restoration of that, and think it's come out very successfully in terms of both the exterior appearance as well as what we've been able to do inside. We've retained that structure and we restored the exterior to, as much as possible, mimic the original building. That's a not-for-profit that's able to accomplish that. Here, I hear a for-profit company complaining about the cost to do this restoration. If I may say, their chairman in December was touting their record profits by Toll Brothers. And if I'm reading correctly, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.3 billion. That was their net income for 2022. I think it's the full year number. They also touts that they have gross margins of 25% or more on their on their sales. So if we take those numbers and apply it to Chappaqua Crossing, there are 91 units. I see one listed for $1.24 million. So I think you do that math, that comes out to about $113 million that they'll earn in sales income. If their if their gross margin's 25%, that comes out to about $28 million that they'll earn from selling those units. So to hear that the cost of restoring this building or adaptively reusing it is a problem for them, I think that's disingenuous. I really think that that's, given that the likelihood is they're gonna make $28 million on selling these units. So, if this is at all a consideration, I certainly would ask you to ask them for detailed cost information so you can see what the actual dollar values are that they're considering, and compare that to the profitability of selling the 91 units. I'd also add that making this building adaptable for ADA purposes. ADA recognizes that there are historic buildings that have challenges for making them accessible. So its standard for accessibility in historic buildings is to the greatest degree possible. So it doesn't expect that you can come to a point where you say, well, we have to tear the building down in order to make it accessible for users. It's what's the greatest degree possible that you can create. So certainly there are abilities to create that accessibility to this building, even to the degree to the second floor. I've done lifts and elevators and all kinds of devices in buildings to create accessibility to second floors, and a lift might cost about $75,000. So yes, that's not cheap, but in the scheme of the cost of the project and the profitability of this, it certainly seems like that's not a big number. So I certainly believe that this building it's able to be made accessible, it's able to be made adaptable to their use, and that's the commitment they made. Lastly, I'd say they referred to their Attorney General filing. I've been involved in Attorney General filings. Presumably that filing identified that we're required to adaptively reuse this building because that's the contract, that's the requirement. It would obviously be a little, I don't know what the word would be, but certainly hopefully they didn't represent that the building could could be redone or somehow not be this adaptive reuse that was part of the requirements. So anyhow, that would be my comments at the moment. Thank you.
So if I could just correct a statement, I'm not the chairman of Toll Brothers, I didn't make
Please come to my.
I didn't make $1.3 billion last year. Had I did, I promise you I wouldn't be here tonight. The responsibility financially for the adaptive reuse of the building is mine. That those dollars have been had to been set aside by virtue of trying to conform to this condition, as my obligation was to each of the entities that I've sold off on this property, that as the master developer, we had to honor all those commitments and pay for all of those things. All of those roads that you see out there, we paid for those. That was our obligation. We're still fixing at the railroad crossing, our obligation. So although my wife particularly would be pleased to know that I made $1.3 billion, it's my problem. So I've been arguing relative to the cost. Toll's concern is functionality. And my wife is the chairman of the Nantucket Historic District Commission. I do not come to you without any kind of favoritism toward historics. Our position, at the risk of repeating ourselves, if what's left of the historic integrity of this asset nowhere near compares to the historic integrity of the cupola, which we did everything under God's green earth to preserve and have done so successfully. And I stand before you with the project that we've built together to say it is a really good collaborative effort. I think you maybe went a touch too far in terms of the conditions that have been placed upon us to keep this building, yet it's got a functional life ahead of it as part of an HOA for a high-end luxury townhome project where only the first floor can be used. And that's what we've been arguing. We're just arguing we think that there may be a better way. So it's my money.
Alright, anyone else?
My name is Janie Allen. I am a former.
You can take that out if you don't wanna bend.
What?
You can take the microphone out if you don't wanna bend.
Okay.
Yeah.
My name is Janie Allen. I'm a former editor at Reader's Digest, and Eleanor Griffith has written some some comments that she would like me to read to you tonight. If I may, she
emailed those, we have those as well.
Yeah, I'll just briefly. Okay, just part of them. I want to say that I want to talk about the need for a exhibit of some sort for the DeWitt Wallace and his wife Lila Bell, who did so much for this community, and we feel like the guest house would be an ideal location for such an exhibit, and even if only in part of the house, even if only in a room or whatever, but it would be long overdue. I say this, I can tell you a little bit about our background. Eleanor and I were part of a group of 4 editors and a local resident of Chappaqua, Laura Anderson. The 4th member was Laura Kelly, who put together an exhibit in 2010 as the Digest was moving out of the building here just before it moved out. And it was called RD, Reader's Digest, the local magazine that conquered the world. This was the only tribute to DeWitt and Lila Wallace and their RD and their Reader's Digest legacy. Unfortunately, it only ran for a year in the Chappaqua, in the Newcastle Historical Society, And then we took it down. And during that year, we got a lot of visitors to there. And there were several articles in the New York Times, and one of them called Recalling the Glory Days of the Reader's Digest spoke about the exhibit. Quote, by the 1940s, well, this is not the quote about the exhibit, but they said, by the 1940s, only one publication exceeded Reader's Digest in sales. It was the Bible. So this is all to say that it was an impressive history. This company had an impressive history worldwide. And she makes several proposals, which I agree with, and several of us here do. Number one, save the Reader's Digest Guest House, this historic building that it is. Not all historic buildings are architectural jewels, for certainly. If you've ever been to Elvis Presley's birth house in Tupelo, Mississippi, you could say that, you know that. It's just a shack. But here we have a really, truly historic building, and it's on the Digest property. To have, to make it an historic landmark, to honor the Wallaces in the Digest would seem to be an obvious thing to do. But then to follow up with that with working collectively to design a permanent mini exhibit area in Chappaqua, perhaps at the guest house, that would be my choice. Or at the Newcastle Historical Society, at the library or the town hall, telling the incredible story of the Digest and the guest house, especially. Also, there were presidents dined there, for heaven's sakes. That head of Outward Bound once dined there with DeWitt Wallace and left with a check for $1 million. So there were so many dignitaries, so many celebrities who came through there, and there's so much. He had so much impact worldwide. The whole world came calling to the door, you know, DeWitt Wallace when he was alive. The Wallaces have been called the preeminent publishers of the 20th century, with once upon a time 100 million readers plus worldwide. In fact, time is running out now. We need to work together to preserve their legacy permanently in Chappaqua. And one fine day, hopefully, to cut some ribbons, serve up some lemonade, and share this incredible legacy with thousands of school kids, locals, and foreign visitors. That's, thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments here in the audience?
Yes, I'll pick this up, or maybe I'm appropriately sized here. Can you hear me? My name is Jody Rolina. I live in Terrytown, but am the current executive editor at Reader's Digest magazine. I worked in the building here for 10 years. Before that, I was an intern. I have a really long history of working for Reader's Digest, and although I was not here when the company relocated, I'm here now, and I can speak to our current legacy, which is we turned 100 years old in 2022, so celebrating 100 years, and currently still have over 13 million readers. There's a significant number of people, both here in the States and around the world, to whom this brand, this magazine is still beloved. We have a presence beyond the magazine, and I'm not here to just talk up the company, but just to say that if we were able to come up with a plan to save the guest house, to come up with a plan perhaps to house some archival material, a tribute to the Wallaces who did so much for this company, this county, this country, that I can assure you there would be people who would still be interested in coming from far and wide to celebrate what Reader's Digest is today, in addition to what it has been for 100 years and will continue to be going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a brief aside, the town doesn't own the guest house, so while I love the ideas of an exhibit to Reader's Digest, and I actually also worked at Reader's Digest, we can't mandate that it happen at the guest house because we don't own that. But it is something that as a town, we can try to think of if there's a place we would wanna put that and house that.
Yes, and I totally understand that and didn't express that fully, but when you do talk about the opportunity to do something there or elsewhere, I completely concur with that and can speak as the current custodian of the archives of Reader's Digest and the need for a good home for them. So I'm happy to talk at any point about that further. Thank you.
I just wanna clarify, cause there seems to be just a little bit of confusion about the guest house. So to expand on Lisa's point, right now it's on private property, right? So I think what's up for debate is whether it's preserved by the developer or whether they tear it down and replicate it, right? I think those are kind of the two choices that we're faced to ponder here, it's this or that. So I just wanted to clarify that for anyone who's confused about turning it into something else. Right now it's on private property.
All right, any other comments here? Come on up.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Raimo Moisa, and I'm originally from Finland, so excuse my English. And
Where do you live now?
North Salem.
Okay.
And I worked for Reader's Digest some 40 years. I'm former editor-in-chief of International Editions. I worked in US since '93. And I can tell you guys, especially Toll Brothers and friends, that I've been living in guest house weeks, months. I've been drinking more than was suitable, so much that I got even the security to stop it. I was alone in the guest house. They had some wire cabinet there. Bad things happen when you're alone. So, and while I have lots of experience about guest house, so I have some experience also renovations. I have a great respect to Toll Brothers and their quality and all that. And I didn't have any idea what restoration of 1730 house means that was collapsing. And somehow I was able to do it. I was able to do it past the historical committees, past the inspectors and everything. And just, I'm still standing here and I have a car and I'm still married. And as I checked today, so in a bank account there's a few $1,000s. So I'm really surprised that for such a fantastic corporation like Toll Brothers, it is such a huge thing to put this place into reasonable condition. And knowing a little bit about life on the 1%ers, so most of them fancy places have also guest houses where when the visitors come for Thanksgiving, you can reserve that room in the guest house and you put your guests there. So you don't have to mess them with at home, right? So I would imagine that what is the price tag if you say that we have a room that President Reagan stayed. So how much would you pay extra for enjoying that? And only way to do it is not to do a replica, but renovate it, restore the old place into what it used to be and use it as guest house. Lots of drinks, lots of good parties, and lots of visitors who stay there. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, is there anyone on the Zoom who has a comment?
No hands are raised.
Okay. John?
We have a lot.
Can you say your name? And
I'm sorry, my name is John Ehrlich, I live at 1 Apple Tree Close. one of the 4 remaining houses that Mr. Lawrence used to sell all of his other houses when he moved in. It's a wonderful area. It's a wonderful place to be. And thanks to the Mr. Lawrence, and thank you, of course, first to the Reader's Digest, which I had many discussions about their decision to move to, I think it was 200 Park Avenue. The former Union building, they decided, there was an editor there that decided that she did not want to remain in this town. So we lost a wonderful, wonderful corporate neighbor. But just to put this aside, living in one of the Lawrence's early houses with a 1928 pedigree, though there's some argument as to whether it was 1930. I know the fact, and we just did this, we took the insulation out that shouldn't have been there. We made a lot of the repairs that is being mentioned. Wasn't all that unreasonable to do. We were glad to be able to do it. There were other guest houses along Roaring Brook Road. There's a guest I won't mention the name of the current tenant, but they retained it and done it. The favorite guest houses. One of the things that they did there was a lot of entertaining. And the Wallaces were also responsible for a wonderful, wonderful vestige, which the town does now own, which is the Performing Arts Center, the Chappaqua Performing Arts Center, which was their former auditorium and where they used to have a lot of discussions and changes and get the whole cast and crew together. And we're trying to modify that now to make more casts and changes and to enjoy it. To retain a historic property in a place like this makes a lot of sense. Maybe one of the solutions we can come up with is some kind of a not-for-profit adjunct to it where people would contribute to do some of these things. We don't want you to get stuck with a large bill that you weren't counting on. And I do want to say this, that the current owner of the guest house has been enormously amenable to following protocols and changing things to our benefit, and we're very grateful. But maybe there's a way we can somehow mitigate some of the economic costs and structures, that's all. But I just wanted to say that I thank you to the Lawrences, thank you to the former generations which made this whole thing possible, and thank you for building a town here in this town and not in Pleasantville as they would like the rest of the world to believe. But yes, right here in Chappaqua. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. All right, any other comments? Sure.
Do you mind if I wanted to follow up on something Felix had said? Felix pointed out that he's got the obligation for doing these repairs. And it strikes me that that's a transaction that he and Toll Brothers have done. It seems, hard to understand that the company that's due to make maybe $30 million on this development has offloaded the obligation to Felix to do this renovation, even though it's part of that arrangement. I would say certainly that arrangement between Toll Brothers and Felix ought to then be revisited, because if they didn't leave enough money in that deal to do the repairs that were part of the obligation, that shouldn't be on you all to then change the arrangement. That's a deal between those two parties. And they would need to restructure that if the cost is more than Felix can bear. Certainly Toll Brothers earning all of that profit can bear that cost. So I would implore you not to be drawn in by that argument that he doesn't have enough money to do the proper repairs. Also, by the way, they've mentioned cost of doing asbestos removal, cost of replacing windows, cost of doing lead paint mitigation. Those would have, the lead paint and asbestos would still have to be done if they're demolishing the building. You can't just demolish a building and throw away asbestos and throw away lead in the garbage. You would have to still do the same mitigations. The windows, they have to put new windows in the new building, same as they would have to put new windows in the old building. So some of these costs that have been identified as sort of exorbitant costs to do the adaptive reuse, they would have to bear those costs anyhow with demolishing the building and building a new one. So the structure, they'd have to build a new structure, foundation support for a new building. So many of those costs are end up going to be comparable whether you're building a new building or working with an existing building. So thank you for clarifying.
Thank you. All right, any other comments?
Hi, how are you? I just wanted to reiterate our request previously that if it seems like there's been an opportunity to make public comment, that you would close the public hearing tonight. Close the public hearing tonight and to consider the amendments that we have requested. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Gray.
Respectfully, please do not close the public hearing. You have a lot on your plate to think carefully about. You mentioned there are two alternatives. There are in fact three. One is to preserve the building. Another is to tear it down and create a replica. That alternative is so unacceptable, is so wrong, that speaking for myself as a historian, I'd rather that you revoke the original resolution, allow them to tear the building down and put up the building they want, but not to pretend that it's anything like a historical building. Okay?
Thank you. All right, so and just to confirm, nobody online has their hand raised, correct?
No hands are raised.
Okay. So we have heard a lot. I think a lot of people have shown up tonight. Thank you for coming. I know it's late. I would like the board, I think, to entertain a motion. We are not meeting again as a board until February 7th, I believe, because next week is the 5th Tuesday in a month and we give ourselves a break every once in a while. So we're not meeting till the 7th. So I would propose closing the public hearing, but leaving it open for written comments, so we can still receive all those written comments for like another till maybe February 1st. No, that's not enough time. Hold on, I don't have a calendar in front of me. For 10 days.
Sure.
7, 8, 9, 10, till February 3rd, which is a Friday, till 5 p.m. on February 3rd. At which point then we can read through all of the, if we receive any additional written comments. I don't know that anyone else is gonna show up in person, but we absolutely wanna hear from written comments. So I would entertain that motion, at which point, on the 7th, we will get together as a board and discuss those what we've received and our thoughts about the matter. So can I have a motion?
A motion to keep
Do what I
written
said.
comment open until February 3rd.
I know,
At 5 p.m.
Can we have a discussion
Sure.
about it? I think that in light of the fact that we have a number of people here, a lot of people, I'm not so sure that And having been on the town board for 1 year, I'm not sure what has been traditionally done, but I would think that if there's a number of people, that we would keep it open until perhaps we see that there are less people who come in. I've heard that done before, so I would be inclined to leave it open. I don't think it would hurt the matter, and then the written period would be the 10 days rather than a lengthier written
So
period.
we can do that, you know, in my experience, we've done that where there have been so many people who've been here to talk that we have not been able to actually get to everybody. Here, everyone had the opportunity to speak. I'm happy to continue, keep this open right now if anyone has anything else to say. But I don't know that keeping it open for public comment here is gonna elicit more people who are not here today who want to speak, is my thought, that if
Right, I don't think we do know.
that we would just keep it open for written comments, people have 10 days to write to the board.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, there are four of us here, so I would defer to the rest of the board, but I would personally keep it open until we see that there are no further comments in person.
Are there any further comments?
I mean, at a different time, I don't know.
Is there any urgency?
I mean, I think that the developer does need to know what they're doing. There are their work permits open, I think they need to know one way or the other, are they keeping it and adaptively reusing it, or are they tearing it down? I think they do need to know that to move forward.
Would we be effectively talking about an additional week if we wait until our meeting?
No, because we couldn't have another hearing until the 7th.
Right.
And then we would keep it open for another week or so for written comments, so it's effectively,
Okay, so
it's probably
the
like 2
time
weeks.
for written comments can't overlap and be closed all at once, is that right?
It could
I guess we could.
Do we have a meeting the week of February 20th? No,
No, the 7th.
No, I'm looking ahead in terms of
No,
just
not
the
the 20th.
Oh, are you
sequence
looking
and how much.
No, we have a meeting March 13th, February 13th, we do not have a meeting President's Week, which means we wouldn't then meet again as a board until February 28th.
If I may, as Jason had pointed out, it's not just about knowing what they're doing. They are under a time crunch here because they are in the middle of construction and they need to be able to move forward also because of the Attorney General's office review of this. So there really is a timing issue here.
I mean, the way I consider is if we should leave a public hearing open also is, are there gonna be new facts presented to us by anyone else that would kind of sway or inform our decision, one way or the other? So
Possibly. I didn't wanna bring this all up, but at this time, the State Historic Preservation Officer, representative, technical, is reviewing this proposal. I think you should not make a decision or shut the hearing until you have that information. I don't know how quickly they can do that.
well, and what are they reviewing it for?
Or I guess a recommendation, but then, I don't know, for some reason they do have to sign off on this. I'm a little fuzzy about the law, but there's this resolution of 2020 which is quite plain. But meanwhile, this new proposal has been made and they're gonna weigh in on it. And I think you should at least wait until that happens, and I don't know how long it can take, although I can check. But if you leave the hearing open, then I'm sure they can make it.
And do you know what this is?
Well, as was mentioned earlier, that the property's been listed as eligible. And I expected SHPO, as the State Preservation Office,
Yes.
to weigh in with a written comment at some point.
Yes.
And we haven't received that yet. But
No.
I whether we hold it open for written comments or whether we just resume on the 7th, would be time enough, I think, to receive that written comment. I don't think anyone's expecting representative to come in person
It'll be a written comment.
here.
And their comment's gonna say, we think this is eligible to be a
It's
landlord.
eligible, and we do not approve of this proposal.
Right, but even if it is eligible, the owner still has to consent, correct?
Quite, but the question of historical significance is very much affected by this. It's something you need to take into consideration.
Okay.
Can I just, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, I just wanna clarify that, yes, we made the submission to SHPO, they are reviewing it, and what they would do is, I think as one of those situations of what comes first, you could make, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you could make the secret determination that you need to make as a board. It would not go to the planning board yet at that point, and so SHPO can at any point during that process be negotiating with us regarding how they wanna proceed, in terms of any salvaging or anything like that might need to happen or documentation that might need to happen from the house. So I don't think there's anything that's prohibiting you from making your secret determination at this point.
Yes, I guess I wish Jill were here. We've had some experience with the state agencies.
Jill's online.
Jill, how long have we been waiting for a CO on the intersection at 117? Yeah. With the DOT?
Let's not compare New York State DOT to anything.
Yeah.
Let's be fair.
They're not the same entity.
But it's the state, isn't it? So I think that politely you have the intellectual and the power to make a determination whether or not our request is reasonable or unreasonable. And we have, if anyone's been up on the site recently, you'll notice that this structure is in the middle of a tremendous amount of construction. And Toll typically wants to finish the clubhouse first, but because of some of the issues that we've addressed this evening, they've waited. But at some point, they need to address that, and it's at the front of the site. So we're looking for a resolution. I think you have the information to make a decision. You know how we feel, you certainly know how Mr. Williams feels. And I'm not so sure what else could come in that would otherwise persuade you one way or the other. So
I just wanna answer to that, Felix, because I hear you. It's not a matter of us making an intellectual decision. We certainly have a lot of information, but it's a matter of our obligation as an elected board to give the public the opportunity to speak. And so that's the only issue that I'm considering at this time. It's not a consideration that addresses the substance. It's about process and our role regarding the community.
Sure.
So that's very different from what you're saying.
I'm not
Which I understand.
I'm not quarreling with public's opportunity to
Right.
speak, but that was advertised for this evening or whatever else you wanted to do.
Right,
So
but that's the issue with closing, a decision to close a public comment.
Right.
So that's what we're looking at, which I know is not within your purview, but I appreciate your perspective.
Okay, well, have you ever met a developer who wasn't in a rush?
I have not.
So at least I'm consistent.
You are, I understand.
All right, what are your thoughts?
I feel that people had the opportunity to come tonight and share their comments. I'm fine with accepting written comment until the 3rd. I don't particularly see a need to keep this open for public comment though.
Holly?
We're split.
I know that they're in a rush, and I know that the community has a lot of feelings on this, but I think knowing that public can submit written comments for at least 10 days, I think I'm okay if we close it.
Okay, so, I definitely hear what you're saying. I think that, I don't know that we're gonna get any additional information. I think even if we work under the assumption, which I think is a valid assumption that SHPO is gonna say this should be preserved, I think we can take that into account, but I would certainly make sure we contact them and let them know that we would like to hear from them within 10 days. I think they should be able to get that information to us. So can I entertain a motion then to close the public hearing but leave it open for public comments for 10 days written comments until 5 p.m. on February 3rd.
A motion to keep written comment open on this issue until 5 p.m. on February 3rd, but close the opportunity for public comment
Right, and adjourn.
and adjourn.
Can I have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed?
Nay, that would be a nay.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate everyone for coming out and for staying so late.
See you next year.
All right, so next on our agenda are just the resolutions. If anyone has them in front of them, it's really not too many of them. It's a consent agenda and 2 resolutions.
Do I have to read all of them? I can, I don't mind. Alright.
Does she have to read
It's
all
fine,
the
I'll do it.
consent agenda items, or can she just say as listed in the consent agenda? Yeah.
I move to adopt the consent agenda as submitted, consisting of the following items listed in our resolutions.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Yeah, I move to approve payment of claims in the amount of $339,907.64. 2022 expenditures totaling $244,425.63, and 2023 expenditures totaling $95,482.01, listed on the summary, pre-check, writing report, and detailed voucher detail reports, all dated January 23rd, 2023. Checks will be issued and mailed to each claimant listed on Wednesday, January 25th, 2023.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I move to authorize the hiring of Linda Lewis for the position of recreation attendant 0270-05 within the Recreation and Parks Department as a driver for seniors at the hourly rate of $18 per hour effective January 3rd, 2023.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I move
Yeah, just do that one.
I move to authorize the hiring of Dylan Rockstall to the position of recreation attendant 0270-05 within the Recreation and Parks Department to work with the basketball and flag football programs at the hourly rate of $20 per hour effective January 25th, 2023.
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, thank you, everybody. Have a great night.